It was in the middle of a laundromat, of all places, that I felt time split open like a cracked egg. The kind of place that hums with 1,000 tiny indignities, coins clinking, buttons rattling in metal drums, someone's dryer sheet wafting its artificial lavender scent across the room. I was leaning against a row of industrial washers, watching my socks swirl in circles, feeling vaguely annoyed about how I had forgotten to bring something to read. My phone had 9% battery left, and even doom scrolling was no longer an option. So I just stood there, bored out of my mind, staring at the peeling posters for lost cats and cheap guitar lessons taped to the window. That's when it hit me. Or, more specifically, when it sang to me. From the corner of the room, a tinny speaker crackled to life and spilled out a song I hadn't heard in decades. Not a particularly good song, either. One of those cheesy late 90s bubblegum pop hits that had been engineered in a lab to sell glittery albums at Walmart. The kind of thing I'd normally roll my eyes at now, but at that moment, it hit like a lightning strike. I wasn't in the laundromat anymore. I was 11 years old, standing in the back seat of my mom's minivan, before seatbelt laws were taken seriously in our family, belting out every lyric like it was a personal anthem. My sister was next to me, our heads leaning too close to the cheap speakers as we fought over which track to play next on the scratched CD we burned off LimeWire. Mom was driving us to the mall because that's what she did when she didn't know how else to keep us entertained. She'd just hand us $5 for the food court and let us roam, trusting that the Orange Julius employees would keep an eye on us if we lingered too long. The song was so bad it was perfect. That overproduced chorus, the absurd optimism of lyrics written by someone who clearly had no actual life experience. The key changed 2/3 of the way in. Hearing it again was like having someone reach into my chest and unearth a piece of me I hadn't realized was still there. The laundromat faded, the buzzing fluorescence dissolving into the gold glow of that childhood memory. I could even taste it, the faint citrus tang of the Orange Julius weed always shared, the way the plastic straw squeaked against the cup. But then, just as quickly, the memory shifted. I was in my middle school bedroom now, the same song blasting from the portable CD player on my desk, my walls covered in posters of boy bands whose names I barely remember. My best friend Amy was sitting on the floor with me, her legs crossed as she painted my nails with some glittery, clumpy polish she'd stolen from her older sister. We were laughing at something ridiculous, probably about the way the singer's voice cracked in the bridge of the song. And for a moment, we were entirely invincible. The kind of invincibility that only exists when you're 12 and convinced that life is something that happens to other people. I felt my throat tighten as the song dragged me deeper into a time I'd long since buried. It wasn't the big moments it brought back, the ones we think define us. It was the little fragments. The cheap perfume Amy always wore that smelled faintly like plastic, the slight wobble in the ceiling fan above us, the way we whispered conspiracies about which boys had crushes on us like we were decoding ancient secrets. The song ended too quickly, and I felt a pang of loss so sharp it almost startled me. The laundromat yanked me back, the room settling around me again like an ill-fitting coat. Someone had spilled detergent on the floor near the coin machine. A toddler was shrieking as their mom wrestled them into a jacket. The song faded into something bland and forgettable, and the spell was broken. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been handed a gift, however fleeting. When my clothes were done, I folded them in silence, but my mind was still sifting through memories like an old scrapbook, stopping on random pages just to linger. I remembered how Amy and I used to choreograph elaborate dances to that song in her driveway, her dad watching from the porch with a bemused smile as he sipped his iced tea. I remembered how I'd cried on that same driveway 2 years later, the day she told me her family was moving out of state, and how I'd played that stupid song on repeat afterward as if it could somehow hold the pieces of us together. I'd forgotten about all of it. Amy, the song, the way it felt to be young and so full of energy that we believed we could change the world with a hairbrush microphone and a pair of jelly sandals. And yet, there it was, hiding in a laundromat speaker, waiting for me to stumble across it like a message in a bottle. When I got home, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked up the song. It felt ridiculous, typing its cheesy title into a search bar like some secret I was ashamed to admit. But when it played, my living room faded, and for a moment, I was back in the minivan, back in Amy's driveway, back in a world that felt infinite. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a reminder of who I'd been, of the parts of me I'd let slip through the cracks of adulthood. I still think about that song sometimes, how it found me when I wasn't looking, how it reminded me that even the smallest, most ridiculous things can carry entire lifetimes inside them. And it makes me wonder, has something ever blindsided you like that? A sound, a smell, a moment so small you almost missed it, but it brought a whole world rushing back to you. I was in my car, stuck in an unmoving line at the car wash, when I noticed the grasshopper. It was perched on the edge of my windshield, right by the wiper blade, perfectly still except for the slow wave of its antennae. It was bright green, the kind of green that feels alive, almost glowing in the late afternoon sunlight. For a second, I wondered if it was real. It had that weird stillness that makes things look fake, like a prank someone might pull. Gluing a plastic grasshopper onto your car is a joke, but then it tilted its head slightly, and I knew it was real. The car wash was crawling along at the speed of a bored glacier, so I had time to study my new passenger. It didn't seem fazed by the noise or the line of idling cars. The antennae twitched lazily, as though it was just enjoying the ride, maybe taking in the view. I cracked my window a little, curious, and leaned forward to get a better look. "Hey there," I murmured, fully aware of how ridiculous I must have looked, talking to a bug in the middle of a car wash line. But the grasshopper stayed put, like it was listening. It didn't hop away or scuttle around nervously. It just was, calm, composed, like it belonged there. And then I realized something strange. The grasshopper was missing one of its legs. It took me a second to notice, but when I did, I couldn't unsee it. The back leg on its left side was gone, leaving this odd, uneven silhouette. I felt a weird pang of sympathy for it, like I was witnessing some small, private tragedy. How does a grasshopper lose a leg? A bird attack? A bad landing? Was it born this way? And more importantly, how is it still here, clinging to my windshield like a tiny, defiant survivor? The line moved forward a bit, and I pulled my car up another few feet. The grasshopper didn't flinch. It held steady, even as the engine hummed beneath it and the wind from my creeping motion ruffled its tiny body. I couldn't stop staring at it. There was something oddly captivating about its stillness, its persistence. That's when I started to wonder, was it scared? I mean, a car is a massive, roaring metal monster from a grasshopper's perspective. Did it understand where it was? Did it care? Or was it just holding on, moment to moment, doing its best to exist in a world so much bigger and louder than it could ever comprehend? The thought made my chest feel tight in a way I couldn't explain. The car wash entrance was finally in sight, with its spinning brushes and jets of water blasting down in violent, chaotic bursts. And that's when it hit me. The grasshopper had no idea what was coming. It was about to be flung into a hurricane of soap and water and foam, and there was no way it could survive that. It would be blasted right off my windshield, thrown into God knows where, probably crushed by one of those giant rotating bristles. I panicked. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed an empty coffee cup from the cup holder, rolled down my window, and started trying to scoop the grasshopper off the windshield. It was harder than I expected. The little guy clung tight, his good leg and the remaining stubs gripping the glass like his life depended on it. I tried to be gentle, but my movements must have seemed huge and terrifying to him. He twitched and skittered slightly, but he didn't jump away. "Come on, buddy," I muttered, trying not to spill the leftover coffee sludge in the bottom of the cup. "I'm trying to help you here." Finally, after what felt like an eternity of awkward scooping and coaxing, he hopped into the cup. I nearly dropped it in surprise. I held it up to eye level, peering in at him like I just caught some rare and precious creature. He looked smaller up close, more fragile. His antennae twitched again, slower this time, like he was considering his options. The car behind me honked. The line was moving, and I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep him in the car. What was I going to do? Take him home and build a tiny grasshopper sanctuary? But I couldn't just dump him back on the windshield either. The honking got louder. I glanced out the window and spotted a patch of overgrown grass near the edge of the lot. A little island of green amidst the concrete and asphalt. Perfect. I rolled down the passenger side window, leaned over, and tipped the cup gently. "Here you go," I said, as if the grasshopper could understand me. He hesitated for a moment, then hopped out onto the grass, disappearing almost instantly into the foliage. I sat back in my seat, suddenly aware of how ridiculous the whole thing must have looked from the outside. A grown adult, late for a car wash, holding up the line to rescue an injured bug. But as I pulled forward into the swirling chaos of the car wash, I couldn't stop thinking about him. That tiny, stubborn creature, holding on against all odds. The way he stayed still, even in the face of something so much bigger and scarier than himself. The way he didn't give up. By the time the brushes started slapping against my car, I realized I felt weirdly lighter, like I'd let go of something without realizing I'd been carrying it. That grasshopper didn't know what was coming. He didn't know if he'd survive, or if there was even a point to clinging on, but he clung anyway. And something about that felt important, in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Now, every time I see a patch of grass or a bug skittering across the sidewalk, I think about him. About how small moments can feel enormous if you're paying attention. So I'm curious, have you ever had a random encounter that stayed with you longer than you expected? Something small but strange that made you feel like the world had nudged you, just a little, in the direction of meaning? It was the escalator that got me. Not the ride itself, but what happened on the way down. The grocery store I go to has one of those flat escalators, the kind designed for shopping carts, where the wheels lock into place and you coast downward at a smooth, machine-dictated pace. Normally, I never think about it. I step on, I stare blankly at my phone, I get off. It's the transitional equivalent of white noise. But on this particular day, halfway down, I noticed something odd. There was a single flip-flop lying in the center of the escalator. Just one. A navy blue rubber flip-flop with a faint swirl pattern on the sole, the kind you can grab for $5 at a gas station if you're desperate. It was positioned perfectly in the middle, as though someone had taken the time to place it there deliberately. That's what stopped me. It wasn't tossed off to the side, or crushed against the edge like debris. No, this flip-flop was dead center, upright, and weirdly pristine. For a moment, I just stood there, transfixed, as the escalator carried me downward. There was no sign of its owner, no barefoot person frantically searching for their lost footwear. It was just there. The longer I stared at it, the stranger it felt. Who loses a single flip-flop and doesn't notice? And why was it so clean, as if it hadn't been stepped on or trampled? The questions hit me so quickly I didn't realize I'd already started to overthink it. As I reached the bottom, I stepped around it carefully, like it was some kind of sacred artifact. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting someone to rush down the escalator and snatch it up, laughing at their own carelessness. No one did. People stepped off the escalator and walked around it like it wasn't even there, like they developed some kind of sixth sense for dodging discarded footwear. By the time I reached the produce section, I couldn't get the image out of my head. I tried to focus on my shopping list. Bananas, yogurt, maybe one of those overpriced salads in the plastic tubs. But the flip-flop lingered in my mind like an unsolved riddle. I kept picturing it, sitting there perfectly upright, almost smug in its stillness. Eventually, I gave in. I left my cart by the avocados and walked back toward the escalator, determined to solve this stupid mystery. It was gone. Not moved. Not kicked to the side. Completely gone. The space where it had been was now just ordinary, boring escalator metal. I stood there for longer than I'd like to admit, staring at that empty spot like it might hold some kind of answer. But there was nothing. No sign it had ever been there at all. I felt strangely deflated. It wasn't like I wanted to take the flip-flop home or anything, but its disappearance felt almost personal, like I'd missed my chance to unravel whatever story it might have told. I wandered back to my cart and finished shopping in a haze, barely registering what I was tossing into my basket. By the time I got home, the whole thing felt absurd. It was just a flip-flop, I told myself. A piece of rubber. Trash. Why did I care so much? But then things got weirder. A few days later, I was walking to my car after work when I saw it again. Or at least, I think it was the same one. Navy blue, faint swirl pattern, same slightly weathered look. It was sitting in the middle of the parking lot, perfectly positioned between two spaces. Once again, no sign of its owner. No pair, no context, just a single flip-flop lying there like it was waiting for me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked right up to it and picked it up. It felt ordinary enough. Light, flimsy, the kind of shoe you'd wear to the beach and forget about by the time you got home. But holding it felt strange. Like it had weight that wasn't entirely physical. I don't know how else to describe it, but the moment I touched it, I felt this bizarre sense of déjà vu. Like I'd seen it in a dream long before I ever saw it on that escalator. I put it in my car. Don't ask me why. It felt ridiculous, carrying around a single flip-flop like some kind of lunatic, but I couldn't leave it there. It felt like I was meant to keep it, at least for a little while. Over the next week, the flip-flop became this weird presence in my life. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't wear it, obviously, or try to find its owner. I just kept it on my dresser, where I could see it every morning when I woke up. I couldn't explain it, but having it there felt, right? Comforting, even. Like it grounded me in a way I didn't entirely understand. And then, one morning, it was gone. Not stolen, not misplaced, just gone, as if it had vanished into thin air. I searched my entire apartment, flipped my mattress, checked under every piece of furniture. Nothing, no trace of it. I'd like to tell you I was relieved, that its disappearance freed me from whatever strange spell it had cast. But the truth is, I miss it. I don't know why, but I do. Sometimes, when I'm on that same escalator or walking through that same parking lot, I catch myself looking for it, hoping it'll show up again. And every time I see a stray flip-flop on the side of the road, my heart jumps, even though I know it won't be the same one. You ever find something completely ordinary that feels not ordinary? Like it belongs to your life in some way you can't explain? Something that stays with you, even when it's gone. The sound came first, like an exhale in reverse, soft and distant but gaining weight, pulling the air with it. By the time I realized it was happening, the light had already bent around the corner of the room, curling against the walls like a living thing. It shimmered faintly, the color of old gold left too long in a drawer. I dropped the book I wasn't really reading and stood, unsure if moving closer was the worst idea or the only idea. The glow grew stronger, more tactile, and I could swear it carried a scent. Something metallic, sharp, like the taste of pennies pressed against the tongue. Then it spoke. Not words exactly, but a low hum that vibrated in my chest, rattling against my ribs like an echo in a hollow place. "Is that a request?" I asked, half joking, because humor was my armor, even when faced with the impossible. The hum shifted, ascending and descending as if calibrating. Then came the voice, layered and overlapping. One tone too many to be human. "You've called. Now choose." "Choose what?" My voice cracked, and I hated how small it sounded. I didn't call anyone. The light flared, brilliant and sharp enough to carve shadows into the walls. "You did." It wasn't an accusation, exactly, but it carried weight. Not in words. In need. In thought. My heart thudded. I backed up a step, but the glow moved with me, almost playful. "I think you've got the wrong person." "Doubt does not absolve you," the voice replied. "You asked." I answered. "The door is open." I glanced toward the hallway, toward the locked front door and the mundane world I knew waited beyond it. "What door?" The glow dimmed slightly, as if amused by my ignorance. "The door inside you. You felt it cracking, didn't you? That itch in your thoughts, that pressure in your chest?" I wanted to deny it, but the words dried up in my throat, because I had felt it. For weeks, maybe months. That quiet gnawing, the sense of being out of step with the world around me, like my life was a radio just slightly off frequency. "What if I don't want to open it?" I asked, almost whispering. "Then it remains ajar," the voice said, as simple as a stone dropping into water. "And it will haunt you until you either close it completely or step through." My legs felt unsteady, and I sank back into the chair, trying to gather my scattered thoughts. "What's on the other side?" The glow pulsed, flickering briefly with something darker beneath it. "What you need, what you fear, what you've forgotten." That's not an answer. It is the only answer that matters. The light began to draw back then, as if retreating, folding itself into the corner where it had first appeared. But the hum lingered, vibrating faintly in the air. "Decide," it said, the voice softer now, almost gentle. "The door is not eternal. It can close on its own." "And if it does?" I asked, my voice stronger now, chasing the light as it dimmed. "Then you remain as you are, waiting." The room went dark again, the ordinary kind of dark, filled with shadows that didn't move and silence that didn't hum. I sat there for a long time, staring at the corner, waiting for the light to return, but it didn't. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff, and the air felt heavier somehow. I moved through the house slowly, switching on lights and half expecting to find that golden glow lurking just out of sight. But it was gone, and the world felt emptier for it. I found myself at the window, staring out at the dark street beyond. The stars were faint, and the moon was thin, and everything looked as it always had. But the words lingered in my mind, curling at the edges of my thoughts like smoke. The door is not eternal. Somewhere deep inside me, beneath the layers of doubt and fear and logic, I knew I'd already decided. I was standing at the self-checkout kiosk, trying to scan a single lemon. The machine kept chirping back at me in a tone that was somehow both polite and passive-aggressive. "Item not recognized. Please try again." I waved the lemon under the scanner one more time, slowly this time, as though I were teaching it to read. "Lemon," I whispered, as though the machine might understand English if I spoke softly enough. It didn't. Instead, it blinked at me, waiting for me to either surrender or call for help. I glanced around to see if anyone was watching, and of course, a man 2 kiosks over was very much watching. His face was caught in that liminal space between sympathy and amusement, the universal expression for, "I, too, have fought the lemon scanner." Eventually, I had to call over the employee who hovered around the kiosks like a lifeguard watching people pretend they know how to swim. "I think your machine hates citrus," I said, trying to make a joke out of the situation. She didn't laugh. Instead, she plucked the lemon from my hand, punched a code into the machine faster than I thought humanly possible, and handed it back to me with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing 1,000 times that day alone. I thanked her, but she was already walking away, back to her post. I paid for my single lemon and walked out of the store, feeling oddly humbled by the whole experience. Later that evening, while cutting the lemon for tea, I kept thinking about the moment at the kiosk, not the frustration or the awkwardness, but the quiet absurdity of the whole scene. Here we are, I thought, living in a world where we can summon groceries to our doors with a tap on a screen, where cars drive themselves and rockets land backwards, but I still couldn't convince a machine to recognize a lemon. It wasn't just funny, it was oddly poetic, this tiny clash between human intention and technological rigidity, a sort of modern fable. Maybe. The lemon and the scanner. This kind of thing happens to me all the time, though. Little moments where technology, for all its promises, feels just slightly off script, like an actor forgetting their lines mid-performance. Just last week, my phone suggested I order my usual from a coffee shop I'd visited exactly once, 6 months ago, while on vacation. The recommendation sat at the top of my screen like a memory from a life I barely recognized. Grande iced mocha. I had never even ordered a grande iced mocha in my own city, let alone while standing in line in some random town I'd passed through. And yet, the algorithm remembered. Or, rather, it thought it remembered. It was like being reminded of an inside joke you don't quite get anymore. But the funniest part? I ordered it. I went out of my way to find a coffee shop just to order a grande iced mocha, not because I particularly wanted one, but because I felt some weird obligation to my phone suggestion. And when I finally had it, sitting there in the flimsy plastic cup with its sloshing ice cubes, I couldn't help but laugh. It tasted fine. It wasn't some revelatory drink. It was just coffee and chocolate, blended into the kind of drink you'd expect someone to sip during a meeting that could have been an email. But in that moment, it felt oddly significant, as though the universe had nudged me to follow through on something ridiculous just to see where it would lead. There's something strange about the way modern life creates these little detours, these tiny, unnecessary rituals born out of convenience and friction at the same time. Like the other day, when my smart speaker tried to order me dog food because it overheard me say the word hungry. I don't even have a dog. What I do have is a tendency to mutter to myself while cleaning, which is apparently enough to set off a chain reaction of assumptions by a device that lives on my kitchen counter. I canceled the order, but I didn't turn off the feature. Part of me wanted to see what else it might try to buy. And then there's the way apps and gadgets try to predict my every need, usually with about 80% accuracy, which is just close enough to feel useful and just far enough to feel unnerving. My streaming service suggested I might like a documentary about the history of fonts. I scoffed at first. What kind of person watches a documentary about fonts? But then I clicked play. An hour and a half later, I knew way too much about Helvetica, and honestly, it wasn't bad. It turns out, I am the kind of person who watches a documentary about fonts. I didn't know that about myself until an algorithm told me. Sometimes, I wonder if this is what it means to live in the future. Not flying cars or robot maids, but a life full of tiny nudges from invisible systems that quietly shape your decisions. It's not dystopian, exactly. It's just peculiar. Like the way my car now greets me with "good afternoon" every time I start the engine, as though we're colleagues working on a group project together. I find myself responding out loud sometimes, "Good afternoon to you, too." I know it's just a machine, but there's something oddly polite about the exchange. It's not like the car cares whether I respond, but I feel rude if I don't. And maybe that's the crux of it. These little interactions, whether with self-checkout kiosks, coffee app suggestions, or overly friendly cars, aren't just about convenience. They're about the way we've started building relationships with things that aren't alive. It's absurd, sure, but also strangely intimate, like catching yourself thanking the GPS when it tells you to turn left. As I finished my tea, now thoroughly infused with the lemon that had started this whole train of thought, I couldn't help but feel a weird affection for the modern quirks that surround us. Life feels faster and stranger than ever, but it's also full of these odd little moments that make you pause and smile. A lemon that won't scan. A coffee order from 6 months ago. A car that says "good afternoon." So I'll leave you with this. What's a little moment of modern absurdity that's stuck with you? Something small that made you laugh, or wonder, or even just pause for a second and think, well, that was unexpected. It hit me the other day, while I was sitting in my car at a red light, that nobody waves anymore. Not the polite, "thanks for letting me merge" wave. Not the casual nod of acknowledgement to a pedestrian crossing the street. Nothing. It's like we've collectively decided that the only acceptable form of communication between strangers is to avoid eye contact at all costs. I caught myself doing it, too. Staring straight ahead, pretending not to see the guy in the crosswalk who had just hustled to get out of my way. A part of me wanted to roll down the window and shout, "Hey, thanks, man." But the thought felt ridiculous. Who even does that? And why did it feel so embarrassing? Like I'd be breaking some unspoken rule. It made me think about how many of these invisible rules govern our lives. Like, who decided that we all have to stand facing forward in elevators, staring at the doors like they're about to open into Narnia? Or that it's weird to sit on the same side of a bench as someone else when the other side is empty? You ever try to break one of these rules just for fun? I have. Once, in a completely empty movie theater, I sat down right next to a stranger instead of leaving the customary buffer seat. He turned to me, looked utterly baffled, and said, "Do you need something?" I panicked, mumbled, "No, sorry," and immediately moved. And just like that, I restored the social order. But it's not just the weird little rules. It's also the silent agreements we've all made with technology. The unspoken understanding that you'll respond to a text message within minutes, or that not liking someone's Instagram post means you're holding some kind of grudge. The way we've collectively agreed to pretend that our phones ringing in public is a deep personal shame. Like we've failed some test of modern etiquette. Once, my phone rang during a yoga class, and you'd think I'd brought a chainsaw into the room. Everyone turned to glare at me, their expressions a mix of betrayal and horror, and I swear even the instructor's soothing "breathe in, breathe out" cadence faltered for a second. The thing is, these invisible rules can be oddly comforting. They give structure to a world that often feels chaotic. Like, if everyone knows to leave the buffer seat in a theater, or to fake a polite laugh when someone says, "working hard" or "hardly working," then at least we're all on the same page about something. But they're also kind of funny when you step back and really think about them. Why do we all silently agree to these things without questioning them? Why do I feel like a social outcast if I don't immediately reply LOL to a joke that isn't funny? Take airports, for example. Airports are like an experimental lab for unspoken social rules. Everyone shuffles through security in socked feet, trying not to look too eager as they reclaim their belongings like a flock of sheep politely waiting their turn. And then, once you're past the TSA gauntlet, there's this unspoken agreement that it's perfectly acceptable to drink a beer at 9 a.m. because you're on airport time. Where else on earth would it be normal to eat a full plate of nachos before most people have had their second cup of coffee? And let's not even get started on boarding the plane, where the entire concept of personal space dissolves, and suddenly it's normal to see a stranger's elbows, knees, and possibly their actual soul. But here's the part one love. Every now and then, someone breaks these rules in the best possible way. Like the time I saw a guy in a suit, waiting for his train, just belting out Bohemian Rhapsody in its entirety, unprompted. He didn't have headphones on, and nobody asked him to stop. We all just stood there, listening to this impromptu performance, half embarrassed, half delighted. Or the time my grocery store cashier started a passionate monologue about how cereal mascots are ruining America. His words, not mine. While he rang up my Frosted Flakes, I nodded along, completely confused, but weirdly appreciative of his commitment to the bit. It's moments like those that make me think about how much we rely on these invisible rules, and how refreshing it can be when someone decides to ignore them altogether. Because as much as the rules keep us in line, they also create a kind of distance between us. They let us pass through life without really noticing each other, like ships moving silently through fog. But when someone breaks the rules, waves at you in traffic, sings at a train station, or just starts a random conversation, it's like they're throwing a rock into that fog, forcing you to actually look around and see the world as it is, not as we've all agreed it should be. The other day, I decided to test this out. I was at a coffee shop, waiting for my latte, when I noticed a guy standing next to me, staring at the pastry case like it held the answers to the universe. Normally, I would have just minded my own business, but instead, I said, "The croissants look like they've seen some things, huh?" He turned to me, startled at first, but then he laughed and said, "Yeah, they've definitely lived hard lives." We ended up chatting for a few minutes, and it was nothing profound, just a conversation about pastries and how overpriced everything is these days. But when I walked away, I felt lighter, like I'd broken through some invisible barrier and found something real on the other side. I think that's what I'm trying to say here. The world is full of these unspoken rules, and most of the time, we follow them without even thinking. But every now and then, it's worth breaking one, just to see what happens. Maybe nothing. Maybe you'll embarrass yourself, or maybe you'll make someone's day a little brighter. Either way, isn't it kind of nice to remind yourself that the rules aren't set in stone? That they're just a game we all play, and sometimes, the best part of the game is making up your own rules as you go? So, what about you? When was the last time you broke an invisible rule, intentionally or not? Did it feel awkward? Freeing? Both? Or do you think some rules are there for a reason? Let's hear your stories. I promise I won't judge if you took the last slice of pizza without asking. The door to the laundromat jingled faintly as I stepped inside, lugging my overstuffed basket of clothes. I hated doing laundry on a Tuesday night, but my work week had already spiraled into chaos, and I was out of socks. The place was empty, aside from the fluorescent hum of overhead lights and the low rumble of a dryer somewhere in the back. The air smelled faintly of detergent and hot metal, the way laundromats always do. I picked a machine in the corner, dumped in my clothes, and started the cycle. My phone was dead, so I leaned back on one of the cracked plastic chairs to wait, staring at the dusty clock above the vending machines. I had just started contemplating whether I could justify buying peanut M&Ms for dinner when I noticed something odd. There was a book on the seat next to me. Not a magazine, not a battered paperback, but an enormous, leather-bound tome that looked wildly out of place among the coin-operated machines and detergent pods. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed, but the embossed gold lettering on the front was still clear. The Archive of Lost Hours. I glanced around the room. No one else was there. No one could have left it. The dryers hummed, and the clock ticked, and the book just sat there, waiting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached for it, half expecting the leather to feel cold or damp. Instead, it was warm, almost alive under my fingertips. I flipped it open to the first page. Inside, there was no introduction, no table of contents, just a single sentence written in elaborate, looping handwriting. To reclaim what was wasted, simply remember. Below that, the rest of the page was blank. I turned to the next one and froze. There, on the yellowed parchment, was an exact depiction of me, sitting in the laundromat just as I was now, basket at my feet, head tilted slightly to the side. It wasn't a drawing, but it wasn't quite a photo either. It was almost like someone had pulled the memory out of my head and stamped it onto the page. Below the image, in the same handwriting as before, was another sentence. This is the moment you start to look back. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound echoed through the laundromat, louder than it should have been. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly, casting strange, jittering shadows across the walls. For a second, I thought about leaving, just grabbing my basket and bolting. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the book seemed to hum faintly, almost imperceptibly, like it was alive and waiting. Or maybe it was my own gnawing curiosity. I opened it again. This time, the pages had changed. They weren't blank anymore. Each one was filled with what could only be described as fragments of time. Images, words, moments, all swirling together in a chaotic, dreamlike collage. I turned a page and saw myself as a teenager, sprawled on the floor of my childhood bedroom, headphones on, music blaring. The scribbled text beneath it read, "An hour spent drowning out the world." Another page showed me at 22, standing in the pouring rain outside an old diner, my phone in my hand, my face a mask of indecision. "The 15 minutes you spent debating whether to call her," it read. The memory hit me like a gut punch. I remembered that night, the fight, the apology I never made, the number I never dialed. Every page was like that, a snapshot of time I'd let slip through my fingers. Hours, minutes, seconds, all carefully cataloged and labeled. Some were small and insignificant, 32 minutes scrolling through pictures of strangers. Others were monumental, the night you stayed silent when you should have spoken. I don't know how long I sat there, flipping through my own life. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The washing machine beeped. The outside world felt far away, irrelevant compared to the weight of the pages in my hands. I saw the afternoon I spent lying in bed, too paralyzed by fear to face the world. The mornings I wasted obsessing over things that didn't matter. The time I could have spent with people I loved but didn't. And then, toward the end of the book, I found a blank page. Not completely blank, there was a single line scrawled across the top. "This is the hour you're living now." Below that, nothing. Empty space. It was jarring, seeing all those meticulously recorded moments suddenly stop, like the book had reached a dead end. My dead end. I stared at the page, and something clicked. The book wasn't just a record. It was a mirror. A reckoning. It wasn't just showing me what I'd lost. It was asking me what I was going to do next. I closed it, my hands trembling slightly. The laundromat was still there, unchanged. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, indifferent to everything I'd just seen. My clothes were done. My basket was waiting. I felt lighter, somehow, like the weight of all those lost hours had been lifted, or at least shared. When I left, the book stayed on the chair where I'd found it. Part of me wanted to take it, but I knew it wasn't mine to keep. Someone else would find it, someone who needed it as much as I had. I walked home that night under the glow of the streetlights, the warm smell of fresh laundry in my arms, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about the past. I didn't think about the future. I just walked, step by step, through the hour I was living now. The morning had a texture to it, like the city had woken up slightly out of focus. It wasn't the weather, though the air was thick with the kind of pre-storm humidity that sticks to your skin like a second layer, but something else entirely, a sensation I couldn't name. It was as though the world had decided to shift a degree to the left without telling anyone, just to see if we'd notice. And I did notice, though not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't the big things that tipped me off, But the way the small things suddenly felt enormous, like someone had turned up the volume on reality just a notch too high. I was standing on the train platform, watching a pigeon drag a piece of string across the ground. Not eating it, not building a nest with it, just dragging it, as if it had decided this was its mission for the day. The string was twice as long as the pigeon, and every few steps, it got tangled around the bird's feet. It would stop, jerk its head to the side, and peck furiously at the string, as if scolding it for not cooperating. People around me were scrolling on their phones or staring blankly down the tracks, but I couldn't look away from this tiny, ridiculous drama. It was absurd, of course, just a bird being a bird, but for some reason, I felt a strange kinship with it, like I too had spent more time than I'd care to admit wrestling with things I should have just let go of. When the train arrived, I boarded with the rest of the crowd, a blur of movement that felt more instinctual than intentional. We all shuffled in, claimed our spaces, and settled into the shared silence of public transit. I found a seat near the window and watched the city smear past in streaks of gray and green. Next to me, a young woman was knitting something with bright red yarn. Her hands moved so quickly they were almost hypnotic, the needles clicking softly with each stitch. She had headphones on and was nodding along to music only she could hear, her face calm in a way that made me envious. Across the aisle, a man in his 60s was reading a newspaper, an actual newspaper, the kind you don't see much anymore. He held it the way you'd hold a fragile antique, carefully folding each page before turning it. At one point, the train jolted, and the newspaper slipped from his hands onto the floor. He muttered something under his breath, probably a curse, though I couldn't hear it, and bent down to retrieve it. The young woman knitting noticed and paused her work long enough to help him pick it up. Their hands brushed briefly as she handed it back to him, and they exchanged a polite smile before returning to their respective orbits. That smile, that tiny moment, lingered with me. It wasn't special in any obvious way, just a fleeting connection between two strangers, but it felt like I'd witnessed something rare, like spotting a shooting star in the middle of a cloudy night. I started to wonder how many moments like that pass unnoticed every day, how many invisible threads tie us to each other for a second or two before snapping. The train stopped at the next station, and more people piled in. An older woman in a bright orange coat sat down across from me, clutching a small potted plant to her chest like it was a child. She kept adjusting the plant's leaves, muttering to it softly as if she were reassuring it that everything would be fine. I couldn't help but wonder where she was taking it, home, maybe, or to someone else who needed a bit of green in their life. She had the look of someone who gave things names. The plant probably had one, though I'd never know what it was. By the time the train reached my stop, I felt like I'd absorbed a dozen lifetimes worth of stories without even trying. The knitting woman, the newspaper man, the plant lady, each of them carried whole worlds with them, worlds I'd never fully understand but could glimpse for a moment before they disappeared. It made me feel strangely small and infinite at the same time, like I was both a part of something enormous and entirely separate from it. I stepped off the train and into the chaos of the station, where the air smelled like burnt coffee and metal. A busker was playing a violin near the exit, his case open on the ground in front of him. The music was rough, full of missed notes and uneven rhythms, but he played with such intensity that it didn't seem to matter. People walked past without stopping, their eyes fixed straight ahead, but I noticed a little girl tugging on her mother's sleeve, pointing at the musician with wide-eyed fascination. The mother hesitated for a moment, then dug into her purse and handed the girl a coin. The girl ran up to the busker and dropped the coin into the case with a loud clink, grinning like she'd just won a prize. The busker nodded at her, still playing, and for a split second, the station felt like it had been transformed into something sacred. I stayed longer than I meant to, listening to the music until it started to blur into the background noise of the city. When I finally stepped outside, the first drops of rain were starting to fall, soft and tentative, as if the sky wasn't quite sure whether it wanted to commit to a full storm. I pulled up my hood and began walking, letting the rhythm of my steps match the patter of the rain. As I turned the corner onto my street, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The pigeon from earlier, still dragging its string. It was perched on the edge of a trash can now, the string hanging limply from its beak like a prize it had finally conquered. I laughed, out loud this time, startling a passing jogger who gave me a suspicious look, but I didn't care. Somehow, the sight of that ridiculous bird made the whole day make sense, even if I couldn't explain why. I walked the rest of the way home with a lightness I hadn't felt in ages, thinking about all the small, strange moments that had stitched themselves together into something larger. And I couldn't help but wonder. If we could see all the tiny, invisible threads connecting us, how different would the world look? Maybe the string wasn't so ridiculous after all. There's this park a few blocks from my apartment, the kind that's more a patch of wild grass and trees than an actual park. No playground, no benches, not even a fountain. Just a winding dirt path and a cluster of gnarled oaks that have been there long enough to look ancient but not quite majestic. I pass it sometimes on my evening walks, though it's never felt like a destination. More of a backdrop to whatever podcast I'm half listening to while avoiding emails I should have answered hours ago. But last Thursday, I cut through it on a whim. It was late, just past dusk, that liminal time when the world seems to hover between awake and asleep. The air was cool, the first real bite of winter starting to creep in, and the ground smelled faintly of wet earth. I hadn't walked 50 feet when I saw something glinting faintly just off the path, caught in the soft spill of light from the one working lamppost. I might have ignored it if it hadn't shimmered the way it did, a tiny flicker like it was winking at me. So, naturally, I left the trail. The thing wasn't much at first glance, just a small silver pin, the kind you'd attach to a jacket or a hat. A crescent moon, no bigger than the tip of my thumb, tarnished around the edges but still strangely elegant. I bent down to pick it up, the cool metal surprisingly heavy in my hand, and as soon as I touched it, a peculiar sensation rippled through me. Not a memory exactly, but the faintest tug of something just out of reach. I turned it over in my palm, studying the faint grooves and worn engraving. It was warm now, as if it had been sitting in the sun all day, though there hadn't been sunlight for hours. I slipped it into my pocket and kept walking, telling myself I'd drop it in one of the park's trash cans if I didn't forget about it by the time I got home. But the longer I walked, the more the air seemed to change around me. The sharp smell of city pavement softened into something sweeter, damp pine needles and wildflowers. The distant hum of traffic was replaced by a rustling so faint I thought it was my imagination at first, like the whisper of wind through tall grass. Even the light had shifted. It wasn't the sickly yellow of street lamps anymore, but a pale silver glow, like moonlight filtered through water. I stopped walking, my heart thrumming in my chest, though I couldn't quite say why. The dirt path stretched ahead of me, unchanged, but something in the air felt alive. Electric. My hand slipped into my pocket without thinking, closing around the pin, and suddenly, there it was, the memory. It wasn't like the usual kind of remembering, fuzzy and indistinct around the edges. It came at me sharp and whole, like someone had dropped me directly into it. I was 12 years old, standing on my grandparents' front porch on a summer evening, watching the fireflies wake up. My grandpa was beside me, holding a little tin box in his hands, his glasses sliding down his nose the way they always did when he was concentrating on something. He handed me the box without a word, his smile hidden behind his thick white mustache but clear in the twinkle of his eyes. Inside the box was a collection of pins he'd been saving for years, things he'd picked up at flea markets, fairs, antique shops. There was a tiny brass acorn, a miniature sunflower, a bright red cardinal, and of course the crescent moon. "Pick one," he'd said, his voice low and warm like the hum of a cello. For luck. I'd chosen the moon without hesitation, running my fingers over its smooth curve, and he'd laughed, a deep, easy laugh that made the whole world feel steady and safe. "Good choice," he'd said. "You're a dreamer. That one suits you." I had forgotten that moment entirely. Forgotten the box, forgotten the pins, forgotten the exact feel of my grandpa's hand on my shoulder as he ruffled my hair and told me to make a wish, just for fun. And yet here it was, as vivid and immediate as if I were standing on that porch again, smelling the faint smoke of my grandma's barbecue drifting from the backyard, hearing the gentle buzz of cicadas in the trees. When I came back to myself, I was standing in the park, the silver pin clenched tightly in my hand. My chest ached, not with sadness exactly, but with something deeper, harder to name. I couldn't remember what had happened to the pin after that day. Maybe it had been lost in the shuffle of moves and years, swallowed by time like so many other little treasures. But here it was again, impossibly, absurdly in my hand. The park looked different now, though I couldn't quite put my finger on how. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker, the path twisting in ways I didn't recognize. I turned around, half expecting the lamppost to still be visible behind me, but it wasn't. Just trees and more trees, their tangled branches knitting the sky shut. I didn't feel scared, though maybe I should have. I just felt quiet, like the world had taken a deep breath and was waiting for something. I stayed there for a long time, longer than I probably should have, tracing the edges of the pin with my thumb and letting the memory settle back into me. When I finally made my way home, the streets felt brighter, noisier, more solid than they had before. The pin stayed in my pocket, and I've kept it there since, like a tiny anchor to a piece of my life I hadn't even known I was missing. What about you? Have you ever stumbled across something small and strange that felt like it belonged to a version of you that's long gone? Something that pulled you backward, or maybe forward, into a memory you didn't know you'd forgotten? When I was 21, I worked for a guy who paid me under the table to clean out foreclosed houses. Work might be a generous term. It was more like digging through the aftermath of people's lives. Cracked picture frames, broken toys, old bills left on countertops like they might still matter. It wasn't a job you bragged about, and it didn't make for great dinner conversation, but it paid me $12 an hour in cash, and I was too broke to care. I don't think I fully understood what foreclosure meant back then. Not in the human sense. To me, it was just a word stamped on the notices we found taped to front doors. I wasn't really thinking about the people who had lived there, only the stuff they'd left behind. The TVs too big to carry, the dressers too heavy to haul, the junk they decided wasn't worth fighting for. My boss, a wiry guy named Carl who always smelled faintly of motor oil, used to tell me, "Don't get sentimental. It's all trash now." And for the most part, I didn't. Until the house with the piano. It was one of those sad little houses you could drive past 100 times without noticing. White siding gone gray, shutters hanging crooked like tired eyes. Carl sent me there alone that morning, handing me a key and telling me to get it done quick. Inside, it was the same mess as always. Stale air, peeling wallpaper, carpet that crunched underfoot. The living room was a graveyard of cheap furniture, and the kitchen looked like it had been abandoned mid-meal, with a plate of something unidentifiable still sitting on the counter. I took one look, sighed, and got to work. I found the piano in the dining room, though calling it a dining room felt generous. It was an upright, the kind you'd find in a school music room or a church basement, shoved against the wall like it was trying to disappear. The wood was scratched to hell, and most of the keys were chipped, but it still looked solid, like it was waiting for someone to play it. I didn't touch it, not at first. I figured it would end up in the dumpster with everything else, so I moved on, boxing up faded cookbooks and a collection of chipped mugs that all said things like "World's Best Grandma." I was halfway through clearing out a cabinet when I heard the first note. It was soft, hesitant, like someone testing the water before diving in. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat, and for a wild second, I thought someone else was in the house. But then another note followed, and another, stringing themselves together into a tune I didn't recognize. It wasn't perfect. Some of the notes were flat, others came out sharp, but it was beautiful in a way I can't quite explain. Like the piano was trying to remember how to sing. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to peek around the corner. No one was there, of course. It was just the piano, and a window cracked open, letting the breeze push its way through. I stood there, staring at it, feeling ridiculous for being spooked by an old, creaky house. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to move. The room felt heavier, somehow, like the air had shifted, filling with a presence I couldn't name. I sat down on the bench without really meaning to. I wasn't a piano player. I'd taken lessons for a few months when I was a kid, but I'd forgotten almost everything. Still, I pressed a key, then another, and before I knew it, I was playing the simplest song I could remember. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The notes came out wobbly, some of them wrong, but it felt like the piano was forgiving me, letting me stumble my way through. I stayed there longer than I should have. I played until my fingers ached, trying to summon songs I hadn't thought about in years, while the sun shifted across the dusty room. When I finally left, I didn't tell Carl about the piano. I couldn't bear the thought of it ending up in a landfill. So I came back that night, after Carl had gone home, and sat with it again, this time in the dark. I didn't play. I just listened, to the house settling, to the hum of the nearby highway, to the quiet presence of something I didn't quite understand. Over the next week, I came back every night. It became a ritual. I'd unlock the door, sit down at the piano, and play whatever I could remember. I didn't even care if the notes were wrong. It was like the house had become a kind of sanctuary, a place that didn't ask anything of me except to exist. I started noticing details I hadn't before. The faint pencil marks on the wall, measuring a child's height year after year. The stack of sheet music tucked inside the bench, some of it handwritten. I could feel the life that had once been there. Echoes of laughter and arguments and small, ordinary moments that didn't belong to me but somehow felt familiar. And then, one night, it was gone. I showed up as usual, but the house was dark in a way that felt different, like a light had gone out that I hadn't realized was there. I sat at the piano and tried to play, but the keys felt stiff under my fingers, the notes falling flat no matter how gently I pressed them. The air felt colder, sharper, and the quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was hollow, empty. I stayed for a while, but it wasn't the same. The next day, Carl sent me to another house, and I didn't go back. I don't know what I expected. Closure, maybe, or some kind of resolution. But life doesn't work that way, does it? The piano stayed with me, though. Not literally, but in the way certain things stick to your ribs, refusing to let go. I think about it sometimes, about the family that left it behind, and whether they ever played it the way I did. I like to imagine they did. I like to imagine it meant something to them, the way it ended up meaning something to me. So, now I'm curious. Have you ever stumbled across something, or someone, that felt like it wasn't just a coincidence? Something small, unexpected, but that stayed with you in a way you didn't expect? I'd love to hear your stories. The wind carried a strange scent that evening, a mix of burnt sugar and rain-soaked earth. It wasn't the sort of thing Vera usually noticed, but as she locked up the bakery, the air felt charged, as though something unseen were holding its breath. She pulled her coat tighter and glanced down the narrow street. The lamps cast weak pools of yellow light, flickering faintly. A figure stood at the far corner, motionless, their face obscured by a hood. Vera told herself not to be ridiculous. This was her street. She knew its rhythms. The tap of her neighbor's cane in the mornings, the metallic rattle of the trash collector at dusk. This stranger, whoever they were, didn't belong. She turned toward her car, but her hand froze on the door handle. The figure hadn't moved, but she felt the weight of their gaze. When she turned back, the street was empty. The unease lingered long after Vera had driven home. She left the television on as she made dinner, its hum filling the apartment. But even as she chopped onions, her knife making rhythmic clicks against the cutting board, her mind drifted to the stranger, who stands in the rain without purpose. She shook her head, annoyed at herself. Maybe someone waiting for a friend, she thought, though the idea felt thin. It was nearly midnight when she noticed the envelope. It hadn't been there when she first came home, white and pristine. It lay on the welcome mat as though placed deliberately. Her name was written on it in sharp, angular letters. She picked it up carefully, her pulse quickening. The paper was heavier than expected, almost waxy. She slid her thumb beneath the seal and unfolded a single sheet of parchment. The writing was meticulous, the kind of script that belonged in another century. You've been chosen. Do not seek the reason. Do not refuse. Beneath the words was a crude map, hand-drawn in ink that bled at the edges. It led to a place she recognized, a clearing in the woods outside town, where no one went after dark. It wasn't the kind of map you could easily dismiss. Something about it felt alive, as if the paper thrummed faintly under her fingertips. She laughed nervously, though no one was there to hear it. A prank, she decided. Some weird attempt at a joke. But when she tried to crumple the letter, her hands refused. It wasn't fear that stopped her. It was the peculiar certainty that whatever this was, it would not be ignored. The woods at night were quieter than Vera had expected, the usual hum of crickets replaced by an unnatural stillness. She gripped the flashlight tightly, its beam cutting weakly through the dark. The path to the clearing was overgrown, branches snagging at her sleeves as if to pull her back. She told herself she'd turn around at the first sign of trouble, but she didn't stop. The clearing wasn't empty. A ring of lanterns surrounded a rough-hewn table, their flames dancing erratically despite the still air. 3 figures stood near it, cloaked and hooded. None turned as she approached, yet somehow, she knew they were aware of her. Vera hesitated at the edge of the circle. One of the figures stepped forward, their face hidden in shadow. "You've come," they said, their voice soft and layered, as though several people were speaking in unison. "I didn't really have a choice," Vera replied, forcing a bravado she didn't feel. "You always had a choice," the figure corrected. "But you came, and that is enough." They gestured toward the table. A box rested there, small and unadorned, its surface worn smooth. Vera stared at it, her instinct screaming at her to leave. "What's inside?" she asked. The figure tilted their head. "Something you've forgotten. Something you must carry again." "I don't want it." The figure's voice remained steady. "You've already accepted it by coming here. Open the box." Vera's hands moved on their own, reaching for the lid. The air around her grew heavier with each passing second. When she lifted the lid, the world seemed to tilt. Inside was not an object but a memory, vivid and visceral. She was a child, crouched by a lake, her fingers clutching a small, writhing bird. Its wing was broken, and her father stood behind her, his voice cold and sharp. "Do it, Vera. It's kinder this way." She remembered the stone in her hand, the sickening crack, the way her heart seemed to splinter alongside the bird's fragile bones. She gasped and slammed the lid shut. The figures didn't move, their silence pressing in on her. "Why would you give this back to me?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. "Because it was never gone," the figure said. "Only buried. What is broken must be acknowledged before it can be made whole." The lanterns flickered out, plunging the clearing into darkness. When Vera opened her eyes again, she was alone, standing at the edge of the woods. The box was gone, but the memory remained, sharp and unyielding. For the first time, she felt its weight fully, no longer dulled by years of suppression. In the days that followed, Vera found herself returning to the lake, to the places she had avoided for so long. The process was slow, uneven, but the memory, once unbearable, began to feel like something else, a story she could hold without breaking. The first thing she told me was that she didn't believe in ghosts, but that her apartment might be haunted. She said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather or warning me about traffic on the way over. "The lights flicker sometimes, but only when I'm feeling guilty about something," she explained, opening her door and gesturing for me to come inside. "And there's this weird cold spot near the fridge, but it's only there when I've been avoiding a decision. So, I don't know, maybe it's not a ghost. Maybe it's just me." I laughed, unsure if she was joking or not. Her expression didn't give anything away. She had this calm, matter-of-fact way of talking that made even the strangest things seem completely plausible. As I stepped inside, I noticed her apartment smelled like oranges and cinnamon. There were books everywhere, piles of them on the floor, on the windowsill, stacked precariously on the kitchen counter. I spotted a guitar leaning against the couch with 2 broken strings and what looked like a child's drawing taped to the fridge. It wasn't the kind of place that screamed first date. But that's what this was, technically. We had met at a record store the week before. I was flipping through a bin of old jazz albums, and she was in the next aisle, arguing with someone on the phone about the merits of movie soundtracks. "If you think The Social Network doesn't deserve to be on vinyl, then we can't be friends," she said, not even trying to lower her voice. I had laughed, just loud enough for her to hear, and she turned to look at me, raising an eyebrow like she was daring me to disagree. 5 minutes later, she'd hung up on whoever she was talking to and asked me what my favorite score was. "No pressure," she'd said. But your answer will determine whether or not I ask for your number. Back in her apartment, she handed me a mug of tea before I even had a chance to sit down. Careful, she said. It's hot, and I think the kettle's a liar about when it's actually done boiling. I took a sip anyway and promptly burned my tongue, which she found endlessly amusing. She sat across from me, curling her legs under herself like a cat. So, she said, tilting her head, what's the worst date you've ever been on? I thought for a moment, then launched into a story about a girl who had brought her mom to our first date because, as she put it, I value her opinion on men. Her mom had spent the entire dinner interrogating me like I was applying for a job, asking about my 5-year plan and whether I had a healthy relationship with failure. She laughed so hard she almost spilled her tea. Okay, I said, once her laughter had subsided. Your turn. She leaned back, crossing her arms like she was about to tell a ghost story. I once went out with a guy who spent the whole evening trying to convince me he was a time traveler, she said. He kept dropping vague hints about the future, like, enjoy paper books while you can, and I wouldn't invest in gas stations if I were you. She took a sip of her tea, shaking her head. The worst part is, he was so committed to the bit that by the end of the night, I almost believed him. The conversation rolled on from there, weaving through topics like a drunken maze. She told me about the summer she spent working in an ice cream truck and how she once accidentally started a minor fire trying to make creme brulee. I told her about the time I got locked out of my apartment in nothing but a towel and had to borrow my neighbor's coat to go buy a spare key. She snorted into her tea and said, "You're either incredibly unlucky or secretly living in a sitcom." At some point, the lights flickered. Just once, but it was enough to catch my attention. She noticed me looking and grinned. See? I told you. Haunted. What are you feeling guilty about? I asked, half joking. Her smile faltered for just a second, so quickly that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching her so closely. Nothing important, she said lightly, waving it off. But there was something in her tone that made me think she didn't entirely believe her own words. A little while later, she stood in motion for me to follow her. I want to show you something, she said. She led me down a short hallway to a small room that looked like an artist's studio had exploded inside it. There were canvases leaning against every wall, brushes and paint tubes scattered across the floor. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and something floral, like lavender. She picked up a canvas from the pile and turned it around, holding it out for me to see. It was a painting of a girl standing at the edge of a cliff, her back to the viewer. The sky was a swirling mix of colors, deep purples, fiery oranges, soft blues, like a storm and a sunrise had collided. The girl was holding something in her hands, but it was hard to tell what. It could have been a bird, or maybe a letter. It's beautiful, I said after a moment. Did you paint this? She nodded, biting her lip like she was nervous about my reaction. It's not finished, she said. None of them are. She gestured to the other canvases, her voice soft. I always get stuck, like I can't quite figure out how the story ends. I looked at the painting again, at the way the girl seemed both brave and uncertain, like she was on the verge of something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it doesn't need an ending, I said finally. Maybe it's enough that she's standing there. She tilted her head, studying me like I just said something she wasn't expecting. You think so? I do, I said, and I meant it. When I left that night, she gave me one of the smaller paintings, a little abstract piece that looked like a field of stars. For luck, she said, handing it to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I still have it, hanging on the wall by my bed. Every now and then, when I look at it, I think about that night, about her haunted apartment and her unfinished paintings, and the way she seemed so certain about everything except herself. It's strange how some people leave a mark on you, even when they don't mean to, like a flicker of light, just bright enough to make you pause. Have you ever met someone who made you believe in things you didn't even realize you doubted? The clock on the mantel ticked in a rhythm that didn't match time as I knew it. Too fast, then too slow, like it was keeping its own peculiar pace. I hated that clock, always had, but it was one of the few things my grandmother had left me, so it stayed. It had been a year since I moved into her old house. A year since I'd stood in this same room, staring at the same walls, trying to figure out what to do with a life I didn't want but couldn't abandon. My grandmother had always said the house had a personality, that it listened. At the time, I thought she meant it in the charming, whimsical way old people sometimes do. Now, I wasn't so sure. The first thing I noticed after moving in was the house never felt empty. Not in the obvious, creaking floorboards kind of way. It was subtler than that. A draft that brushed your shoulder like fingers. A shift in light that seemed intentional. I told myself it was grief, that I was imagining it because I missed her. But grief doesn't explain everything. One night, I found a door I'd never noticed before. It wasn't hidden, not exactly, but it was in a place so ordinary, between the pantry and the back stairs, that it felt almost absurd I hadn't seen it before. The door was small, barely tall enough to stand upright in, and painted the same off-white as the walls, blending in seamlessly. I hesitated before opening it, my hand on the cold brass knob. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, just off, like touching the seam of a poorly mended scar. But curiosity won out. It always does. The space beyond wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a closet or a crawl space. It was a room, though calling it that feels insufficient. It was circular, its walls lined with shelves filled with objects that seemed to belong to no particular time or place. A silver teapot with intricate etchings, a yellowed photograph of a woman whose face was scratched out, a violin missing its strings. At the center of the room stood a table, and on the table lay a book. Its cover was unmarked, a dull black that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. I reached for it, half expecting it to be warm to the touch, but it was cool, smooth. When I opened it, there were no words. Just pages and pages of blank, cream-colored paper. That should have been the end of it. I should have closed the door, forgotten the room, pretended it never existed. But I didn't. I kept going back, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. One night, while sitting at the table with the book in front of me, I decided to test something. I took a pen from my pocket, clicked it open, and wrote a single sentence on the first page. I wish I could speak to my grandmother one more time. The ink sank into the page like water into soil, vanishing almost instantly. I stared at the blank paper, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Disappointed, I closed the book and left the room. That night, I dreamed of her. She was sitting in her armchair by the fire, knitting something I couldn't quite make out. When she looked up at me, her eyes were the same but different, like they held more light than they should. She didn't speak, just smiled, a sad kind of smile that made my chest ache. When I woke, I knew it hadn't been an ordinary dream. Her presence lingered in the room, faint but undeniable, like the echo of a bell long after it's been struck. I wrote in the book again the next day. This time, I asked for something smaller, less weighted. Show me what I've forgotten about this house. Again, the ink disappeared, and nothing happened immediately. But over the next few days, I began to notice things. A loose floorboard in the hallway that creaked a different melody than the others. A painting in the upstairs bedroom that, when tilted just right, revealed a hidden compartment in the wall. Each discovery felt intentional, as though the house was revealing itself to me, one secret at a time. The more I wrote, the more the room seemed to change. The objects on the shelves shifted subtly, new items appearing while others disappeared. The air grew heavier, charged, like the moments before a storm. And the book? Oh, the book. It began to feel alive beneath my hands, as if it were breathing in time with the house. I should have stopped. I knew that. But curiosity is a cruel master, and I kept feeding it. I asked questions about my family, the house, even myself. The answers came in pieces, scattered and incomplete, but they were enough to keep me hooked. Then, one night, I asked the wrong question. What don't I want to know? The room changed instantly. The air turned icy, and the light from the single bulb overhead flickered violently before going out altogether. When it came back on, the book was closed, and the pages felt heavier when I tried to open them, as though resisting my touch. When I finally pried it open, the words were already there, written in a script that wasn't mine. You shouldn't have asked. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting as though alive. The objects on the shelves began to hum, their tones discordant and shrill. The air pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the table. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me. But even now, as I sit in the safety of the living room with the hated clock ticking too fast and too slow, I feel it. The pull of that door. The weight of the book's unanswered warnings. The house is listening, just as my grandmother said, and it's waiting for me to open that door again. I was in line at the post office, holding a package that was 3 times as large as it needed to be. Inside it was a single ceramic turtle I'd found at a flea market, something my sister had admired once during a call. I'd promised to send it to her, but now, standing there under buzzing fluorescent lights, I was questioning why I'd gone through the effort at all. The clerk at the counter looked half asleep, the person in front of me was arguing about stamps, and somewhere in the back of the line, a toddler was having an existential meltdown over a lollipop. I was ready to call it quits and leave when I heard someone behind me say, "You look like you're shipping something cursed." I turned around, and there he was, mid-30s, wiry, a tangle of curly hair that seemed perpetually windswept. He was holding a thin envelope, wearing a jacket that had seen better days, and looking at me with an expression that fell somewhere between amused and concerned. "It's not cursed," I said, though I couldn't say it with confidence. "It's a turtle. Ceramic." He nodded, as if this explained everything. The perfect object for summoning spirits or dooming someone to a lifetime of bad luck. Good choice. I laughed, partly because I wasn't sure what else to do. "It's a gift for my sister," I clarified, as if that made it any less bizarre. "Well, if you want to make sure it doesn't come back to haunt you, I'd recommend dropping it in the river instead of mailing it," he said, stepping closer. "But what do I know? I'm just the guy behind you in line." We didn't speak again until we both left the post office at the same time, though I noticed he watched me pay for postage like he was keeping track of whether or not I'd actually go through with sending the cursed turtle. As we walked out, he gestured to the coffee shop across the street. "Do you believe in coincidences?" he asked suddenly. "Is that a pickup line?" I countered, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged. "Maybe, but mostly I'm curious. Because I was about to go sit in there and write a story about someone sending a cursed turtle through the mail, and now here you are, sending a turtle through the mail. Feels like the universe is trying to tell me something." There's a moment in every weird encounter where you have to decide if you're going to lean into the weirdness or walk away. Something about his curiosity, his sense of humor, made me lean in. "Okay," I said. "Let's say I believe in coincidences. What kind of story are you writing?" He grinned, motioning me to follow him. "Come find out." The coffee shop was small, crowded with mismatched chairs and secondhand tables. He claimed a spot in the corner, pulling out a battered notebook and a pen that looked like it had been chewed on. "I'm Leo, by the way," he said, as though introducing himself was an afterthought. I told him my name, and he nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. "You're officially a character now," he announced, as though this was perfectly normal behavior. "What's the plot?" I asked, curious despite myself. "That's the fun part. I don't know yet," he admitted. "But it starts with a ceramic turtle, a post office, and a person who doesn't realize they've just mailed something that will change their life forever." "Sounds like nonsense," I said, taking a sip of the coffee he'd insisted on buying for me. "Of course it's nonsense," he replied cheerfully, "but so is most of life." I stayed longer than I'd intended, watching as he alternated between asking me absurd questions. If you were a ghost, would you haunt people politely or just make chaos? And scribbling furiously in his notebook. Every so often, he'd pause, look at me, and say something like, "Do you think curses have a scent? Like burnt toast or pine needles?" At one point, he drew a diagram of a turtle shell and labeled it "Portals to Infinite Dimensions," which made me laugh so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. By the time the sun started to set, I realized I'd told him more about my life than I'd intended. How I'd moved to this city on a whim, how my sister and I used to collect ceramic animals when we were kids, how I felt like I was stuck in a loop of predictable days that never seemed to lead anywhere. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as though filing away each detail for his story. "Here's the thing," he said finally, closing his notebook with a satisfied thud. You could keep living the same predictable days, or you could treat every weird moment as a doorway. A doorway to what? I asked skeptically. To whatever you want, he said, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. But you have to walk through it. Otherwise, it's just a wall. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. As we left the coffee shop, he handed me a piece of paper he'd torn from his notebook. Here, he said, in case you want to read the story someday. Then he waved and disappeared into the crowd. The paper wasn't a story, though. It was a map. Not a real map, but a sketch of places I'd mentioned. Parks, streets, landmarks, and arrows pointing from one to the next. At the bottom, he'd written, "Doorways are everywhere. Go find one." For reasons I still can't explain, I did. That night, instead of going straight home, I wandered the city with the map in hand, following his strange little trail. One of the spots he'd marked was a park I'd never been to, where a jazz trio was playing under fairy lights strung between the trees. Another was a second-hand bookstore where the owner recommended a novel that became my favorite for months afterward. At each stop, I found something small but unexpected. A moment, a conversation, a piece of something that felt like it had been waiting for me. I never saw Leo again. I don't know if he actually wrote the story or if I was just a passing curiosity to him. But every now and then, when I catch myself falling into predictable days, I think about that map and the way he said, "Doorways are everywhere." And I wonder if maybe that's all life is. Finding the courage to walk through the strange and unexpected doors someone leaves open for you. Have you ever followed a random path and found something you didn't even know you were looking for? There's a man who rides past my house every morning on a bicycle, always at 7:13 a.m. sharp. I've never spoken to him, but I've noticed a few peculiarities. He's always dressed in a suit, pinstriped, well-tailored, with polished black shoes, and he's always balancing something impossible on the handlebars. One day it's a ceramic vase with fresh-cut flowers. Another day it's a typewriter. I once saw him ride by holding a bird cage with an actual parrot inside, the bird squawking indignantly with every bump in the road. But the thing is, he never looks rushed, never wobbles, never acknowledges that this is, in any way, unusual. He just pedals steadily by, his expression calm, as if this were the most natural way in the world to commute. At first, I thought I was imagining him. Who bikes in a suit? Who balances an antique clock on their handlebars and acts like that's perfectly reasonable? But he's consistent. Every morning, the same man, the same bicycle, the same aura of quiet absurdity. I've started looking for him, actually. At 7:10, I'll make my coffee and stand by the window, waiting for him to appear like clockwork. He always does. And then, just as quickly as he arrives, he vanishes down the street, leaving me staring at my lukewarm coffee and wondering what the hell I just saw. One day, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow him. I threw on some sneakers and jogged after him as soon as he passed my house. I kept my distance, not wanting to spook him, though, really, what could I have done to unnerve a man who rides a bike with a phonograph teetering on the handlebars? He turned down a side street, then another, and then, bizarrely, into the entrance of an abandoned shopping mall. At this point, I was equal parts confused and intrigued. I slipped in after him, hiding behind a row of dusty, potted plants. The mall was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's been sitting there for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. The man dismounted his bike and wheeled it toward what used to be a department store. His shoes echoed against the cracked tiles. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound. He stopped at the entrance of the store, leaned the bike against the wall, and pulled out a key from his pocket. A key for a door that shouldn't even lock anymore. He unlocked the glass doors and stepped inside, leaving the bike and its cargo, a single chessboard with the pieces mid-game, outside. I don't know what I was expecting to see when I peeked in, but it wasn't this. The inside of the store was alive. Not alive, like people bustling around, but alive like a dream. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, their soft glow bouncing off mirrors that seemed to bend and ripple like water. Tables and shelves were filled with items that didn't make sense together. An old rotary phone next to a stack of vinyl records, a pair of ballet slippers hanging beside a globe with entire countries missing. And there, At the center of it all was the man. He was lighting a lantern, humming to himself as if this were just another day in whatever surreal world he inhabited. I couldn't help myself. I stepped inside. The air felt different immediately. Cooler, but not cold. Lighter, but not thin. It smelled faintly of citrus, like someone had just peeled an orange in the next room. The man looked up, startled but not angry. His expression shifted quickly into something like bemused curiosity, as if I were the strange one in this scenario. "You're early," he said. I had no idea what to say to that. Early for what? Before I could figure out how to respond, he gestured for me to follow him. He didn't seem annoyed by my intrusion. If anything, he looked pleased, like he'd been waiting for this moment. He led me deeper into the store, past a mannequin dressed as a pirate, past a bookshelf filled with handwritten journals, past a stuffed fox wearing a monocle. Finally, we stopped in front of a table. On it was a small glass box, and inside the box was a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts. "She's been expecting you," he said. Now, this was the point where any rational person would probably have backed out of the store slowly and gone home to reevaluate their life choices. But something about the way he said it, calm, matter of fact, like he was handing me my dry cleaning, made me stay. He opened the glass box and handed me the card. It was heavier than I expected, the edges warm, as if it had been sitting in the sun. "What is this?" I asked, finally finding my voice. He smiled. "It's yours." That's when the lights flickered. Just once, but enough to make my heart jump. When they came back on, the man was gone. The store was gone. I was standing in the middle of the empty mall, holding the Queen of Hearts in my hand. The bike, the chessboard, the mirrors, all of it had disappeared. It was just me, the card, and the sound of my own breathing. I haven't seen the man on the bike since that day. Every morning, I still stand by the window at 7:10 with my coffee, but he doesn't appear. The Queen of Hearts is sitting on my desk now, in a little frame. I've tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was some kind of elaborate prank or a particularly vivid daydream. But every time I look at that card, I feel the faintest hum, like a vibration just beneath the surface of the paper. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but it's there. Sometimes, late at night, I think about going back to the mall. I want to see if the door will open for me, if the lights will flicker, if the man will be there, humming and lighting his lantern. But something stops me. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the sense that whatever I stumbled into wasn't meant to be chased. Or maybe it's just the knowledge that, sometimes, the best stories are the ones that don't get finished. So now, I have to ask, have you ever come across something that didn't feel quite real? Something you couldn't explain, no matter how hard you tried? Something you weren't sure you wanted to explain? I met him at a bus stop at 2:13 a.m., which is, objectively, one of the worst places to meet anyone. The kind of place that reeks of diesel fumes and leftover adrenaline from the nearby bar's closing rush. It was the dead zone of the city, too late for decent people and too early for the ambitious ones who jog before sunrise. But there we were, waiting for a bus I wasn't even sure would show up. He had a guitar case slung over his shoulder, one of the latches held together with duct tape. I had a bag of stale donuts I'd picked up from the convenience store when the cashier told me they were about to throw them away. He wasn't what I'd call handsome, at least not in the magazine cover kind of way. His nose looked like it had been broken once, and his hair was this unkempt tangle that probably hadn't seen a brush in weeks. But there was something about the way he was standing, completely still, as if he wasn't waiting for the bus so much as waiting for the universe to make its next move, that made it hard to look away. He noticed me staring and raised an eyebrow. "You here for the donuts or the bus?" he asked. His voice was low, gravelly, like he'd been yelling at a concert or chain-smoking for years. "Both, I guess," I said, holding up the bag like it was some kind of explanation. "Do you want one?" He laughed, a quick, sharp sound that almost seemed to catch him off guard. "You offering me donuts at a bus stop in the middle of the night? That's a first. I'm just saying they're free, and I don't want them all. Unless you're too good for day-old donuts." He considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Nobody's too good for free food." He set his guitar case down and reached into the bag, pulling out a powdered one. He bit into it, and for a second, he He looked like he was trying not to smile. Not bad, he admitted. Tastes like regret, but in a good way. We started talking after that, trading comments about the kind of people who wander around the city this late. He told me he'd been playing a gig at some dive bar down the street, the kind of place where the beer's warm, the crowd's half interested, and the owner doesn't believe in paying musicians on time. "What about you?" he asked. "What's your excuse for being out here?" "I couldn't sleep," I said, which was technically true but not the whole story. I wasn't about to tell him that I'd been feeling this strange, restless energy all night, like I needed to get out and breathe city air or risk being swallowed by my own thoughts. It sounded dramatic, even to me. He nodded like he understood, though, and we fell into a comfortable silence. The kind that doesn't demand anything from you, where it feels okay to just exist next to someone for a while. Eventually, he gestured to his guitar case. "Want to hear something?" I hesitated. "You're just going to play here? At a bus stop?" "Why not?" he said, already unlatching the duct tape. "The acoustics are terrible, and I'll probably piss off that guy sleeping on the bench over there, but I've played worse places." He pulled the guitar out and adjusted the strap, then looked at me. "Any requests?" I told him to surprise me, so he started playing this slow, haunting melody I didn't recognize. His fingers moved across the strings like they were searching for something. An answer, maybe, or just a place to land. The song didn't have words, but it didn't need them. It felt like the kind of music you'd listen to alone in your room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything you've ever done wrong. But somehow, it wasn't sad. It was full of this quiet, raw honesty that made me feel like I was hearing a secret too beautiful to keep. When he finished, he looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "What did you think?" I didn't know how to answer. I just nodded, because it felt like if I tried to put it into words, I'd ruin it. He smiled, the kind of smile that's more in the eyes than the mouth. I'll take that as a good sign. The bus still hadn't come, and part of me was starting to wonder if it ever would, but I didn't mind. For some reason, sitting there with him felt like exactly where I was supposed to be, like the whole night had conspired to bring me to this random moment with this random guy. "I think you should write words for that song," I said finally. "It feels like it's missing a story." He tilted his head, considering this. "Maybe. Or maybe it's better without one. Sometimes, when you give something a story, it loses all its possibilities." "You know?" I didn't know, not really, but I nodded anyway. "So you're just going to leave it unfinished?" "Not unfinished," he corrected. "Just open-ended." I like that. The idea that something didn't have to be complete to mean something. That it could just exist, messy and unresolved, and still matter. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the dark like twin beacons, I almost didn't want to get on. I hesitated, standing there with my bag of donuts while he strapped his guitar back into its case. "So, where are you headed?" I asked. He shrugged. "Wherever this thing takes me, I guess. Got nowhere else to be." That felt like the right answer. "Well, thanks for the song," I said, stepping onto the bus. He didn't say anything, just gave me a little two-finger salute before turning back toward the empty street. As the bus pulled away, I watched him in the rearview mirror, his guitar slung over his shoulder, his silhouette fading into the city's shadows. I never saw him again, but every now and then, I think about that night, about the song he played, and the way he talked about leaving things open-ended. And I wonder if maybe that's what we all are. Unfinished songs, waiting for someone to listen and hear something we can't quite put into words. Have you ever felt like a single moment could be both fleeting and infinite at the same time? I was at the hardware store on a Saturday afternoon, which is never a good sign. If I'm at a hardware store, it usually means something in my apartment has gone catastrophically wrong, and I've entered the phase of denial where I convince myself I can fix it. This time, it was my shower. The faucet had been leaking for weeks. An annoying little drip, drip, drip that I'd ignored until my bathroom started to feel like a set piece from a water torture scene. So there I was, wandering through aisles of tools and pipes with absolutely no idea what I was looking for. Somewhere between the plumbing section and the aisle with the inexplicably large collection of duct tape, I saw it. The light bulb graveyard. That's not its official name, obviously, but that's what it felt like. It was just a sad little bin of used light bulbs, the kind you're supposed to recycle responsibly, but most people probably forget about. Some of them were intact, others shattered into jagged edges, and a few had that weird black scorch mark in the middle, like they died dramatically. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was because of how quiet the store was. Maybe I was just trying to avoid confronting my total lack of plumbing knowledge. Either way, I stood there staring at the bulbs, feeling oddly reverent. One of the bulbs caught my eye. It was one of those old-fashioned Edison-style ones, the kind hipster coffee shops hang above their counters to make you feel like your $6 latte is an experience. But this one was different. The filament inside wasn't broken. It was perfectly intact, coiled in a delicate spiral, like it hadn't accepted its fate yet. Something about it made me reach in and pick it up. The glass was smoother than I expected, almost soft in its curve, and I found myself holding it up to the light. For a second, it almost looked alive, the filament catching the faint glow of the overhead fluorescence. I didn't even realize someone was standing next to me until they spoke. Funny, isn't it? The voice startled me so much I nearly dropped the bulb. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 70s, leaning on a cart filled with an eclectic mix of screws, gardening gloves, and a single bag of sunflower seeds. He nodded toward the bulb in my hand. How something so small can hold so much light. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Yeah, I said, because apparently that was the best I could do. The man smiled, a kind of slow, knowing smile that made me feel like I just stumbled into a conversation that had been waiting for me. You ever think about how much work goes into making one of those? He asked. The glass, the filament, the wiring, all those little parts, just to make light. And then one day, poof. He snapped his fingers. It's done. All that effort, and it's over in a second. I looked at the bulb again, suddenly feeling like I was holding something far more significant than a piece of discarded junk. Yeah, I guess I never thought about it like that. The man nodded, his gaze drifting toward the bin. People are a lot like light bulbs, you know? You burn bright for a while, but eventually, he trailed off, letting the sentence hang in the air like a half-formed thought. Then he chuckled, more to himself than to me. The trick is to make the light count while it's on. I wasn't sure what to say to that. Part of me wanted to ask him what he meant, to dig into whatever story he seemed to be hinting at, but another part of me felt like he'd already said enough. Instead, I just nodded, holding the bulb a little tighter in my hand. Yeah, I said softly. I guess that's the trick. The man gave me one last smile, then tipped an imaginary hat and wheeled his cart down the aisle, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a moment, staring after him, before looking back at the bin. I didn't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to put the bulb back. It felt wrong, like I'd be abandoning it somehow. So I tucked it into my pocket, telling myself I'd find a way to recycle it properly later. I left the hardware store with the wrong size washer for my faucet, predictable, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man and his words. Make the light count. It sounded simple, but the more I thought about it, the heavier it felt. How often do we even notice the light we're making? How often do we stop to appreciate it, let alone make it count? That night, I placed the bulb on the windowsill in my kitchen, where the evening light hit it just right. It caught the glow of the setting sun, the filament inside casting tiny, spiraling shadows on the wall. It wasn't plugged in. It wasn't burning bright. But somehow, it still felt alive, still part of something bigger than itself. The funny thing is, I never ended up fixing the faucet. The drip is still there, soft and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock I forgot to wind. But the bulb stayed on the windowsill, a quiet little reminder of something I'm still trying to figure out. So here's my question for you. What's the smallest, simplest thing that's ever stopped you in your tracks and made you think about life a little differently? The summer I worked at the funeral home, I told no one. Not my friends, not my family, not even my roommate, who just assumed I was temping at an office somewhere. It's not that I was ashamed exactly, I just didn't know how to explain it. How do you casually bring up over breakfast that you spend your days with the dead? And it wasn't even the respectable kind of funeral work, like being a mortician or a director. No, I was in the back, sweeping floors, polishing urns, and hauling caskets like some underpaid. Macabre stagehand. I'd applied for the job on a whim, half joking, after seeing the listing on a job board at my college. Part-time assistant needed, funeral home, it read. No experience necessary. Flexible hours. I remember laughing as I clicked to apply, thinking, why not? At least it wasn't retail. I didn't expect to get the call 2 days later. The place wasn't what I imagined. There were no dark, gothic curtains, no solemn organ music playing softly in the background. It was clean and clinical, like a dentist's office, with beige walls and fake plants in the corners. My boss, Dan, looked more like a guy who sold insurance than someone who managed death for a living. He was balding, perpetually tired, and prone to whistling off-key as he worked. On my first day, he handed me a pair of latex gloves and said, "Don't overthink it. Just remember, they don't bite." My job wasn't glamorous. Most days I cleaned, scrubbed the tile floors, wiped down the embalming tables, and made sure the chapel smelled more like lilies than formaldehyde. When I wasn't cleaning, I was running errands, picking up death certificates, delivering flowers to grieving families, or double-checking that the names on the caskets matched the paperwork. Dan made me handle the phones once, but after I accidentally told a caller their loved one would be ready for pickup like they were a dry cleaning order, he reassigned me to nonverbal tasks only. Fair. The strange thing is, I didn't hate it. It was peaceful in a way. Quiet. Nobody rushed me or barked at me to move faster, and there was something weirdly satisfying about making things look nice for people who'd never get to see them. Sometimes, I'd find myself talking to the bodies, not in a creepy way, more like the way you talk to a cat who doesn't care you're there. "You've got a nice suit," I'd say while straightening someone's tie. Or, "Looks like a full house for your service tomorrow," while arranging chairs in the chapel. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it made me feel less alone. And then there was the basement. I didn't go down there often. Dan kept most of the supplies upstairs, and the basement was mostly for storage. Old caskets, extra wreaths, and boxes of paperwork no one had bothered to file. But every so often, Dan would send me down there to grab something. "Check the shelf on the left," he'd say, and I'd steel myself for the trip. It wasn't a scary basement, not really. No cobwebs, no flickering lights. Just cold concrete walls and the low hum of a dehumidifier. But it felt different. Heavy, almost. Like the air was thicker down there. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into the job, Dan asked me to retrieve a specific urn from the basement. "It's in the back," he said, handing me a photo of a bronze urn shaped like an angel. "You can't miss it." The basement was colder than usual that day. I could feel it through my shoes, the chill seeping up through the soles. The urn wasn't where Dan said it would be, so I had to dig through boxes, my breath clouding in front of me in the dim light. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound came again, this time from behind me. "Dan?" I called, though I knew he wouldn't be down there. The sound stopped. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw nothing but stacks of boxes and a row of unused caskets. The rational part of my brain told me it was the dehumidifier kicking on, or maybe the pipes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed the urn and bolted upstairs without looking back, slamming the basement door behind me. I didn't tell Dan what happened. I didn't tell anyone, but from that day on, I avoided the basement unless absolutely necessary. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by too many hours spent surrounded by death. But little things started happening after that. The lights in the prep room would flicker, even though Dan insisted it was just faulty wiring. I'd find tools out of place, items I was sure I'd put away suddenly lying on the counter. Once, when I was locking up for the night, I heard footsteps in the chapel. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing. "Probably the floor settling," Dan said when I mentioned it casually, but his expression told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. The last week of my job, I was polishing a coffin in the showroom when I felt it, a light tug on the back of my shirt. I turned around, expecting to find Dan or maybe one of the flower delivery guys, but no one was there. The air felt colder again, the way it had in the basement. I stood there for a long moment, holding my breath, and then whispered, "I'm just trying to do my job, okay?" The chill lifted. The room felt normal again. I quit the following Monday. Told Dan I was going back to school, which wasn't a lie. I just didn't mention that I'd moved all my classes online, so I wouldn't have to set foot in another building like that again. I still think about that summer sometimes, though. About the things I saw and felt and can't explain. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in something. Energy, maybe. Echoes of what people leave behind. So, now I'm curious. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question what's real and what isn't? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. The first time I noticed the door, I was walking home from work. Not rushing, just meandering through the same sleepy streets I'd traveled for years, past the same laundromat with its blinking neon sign, the same convenience store where the clerk knew my snack order by heart, and the same tired brick buildings that leaned into each other like old friends too stubborn to stand upright alone. It was late, and the city felt muted, like the volume had been turned down a few notches. The door was set into a wall where, as far as I remembered, there had never been one before. It was narrow, dark, and unmarked, wedged between a bakery that always smelled like burnt sugar and a barbershop with a bell that jingled every time someone walked in. But what struck me wasn't the door itself. It was how, for a split second, it felt like it was looking at me. Not, I'm losing it and need to sleep, looking, but a soft, deliberate awareness, like it knew I had seen it and was waiting for me to do something about it. I stopped mid-step, standing there in the cold as the world carried on around me, and considered it. But there was no handle, no sign, no reason to believe it would open if I tried. So I shook my head, laughed under my breath, and kept walking. The second time I saw it, I had no excuse. It was a Sunday, mid-morning, and I was on my way to buy coffee after running out at home. The streets were busier than they had been that night. Strollers, dogs on leashes, couples walking hand in hand. And there it was again, in the exact same spot, looking no less plain and no less out of place. This time, I stopped. I stood in front of it, letting the world blur at the edges, and stared. It was painted a dull gray, the kind of gray that fades into the background of most cityscapes, but up close, I realized the surface wasn't smooth. It was etched with faint patterns that didn't form any image I could recognize, but made me think of constellations, like someone had mapped the night sky onto its wood. A couple walked past me, glancing my way before whispering something to each other. I realized how I must have looked, just standing there, coffeeless and staring at what appeared to be nothing more than an old door that no one else seemed to care about. I reached out on impulse and pressed my hand against it. It was warm, not lukewarm, not heated by sunlight, warm, like the skin of a living thing. I yanked my hand back, startled, and laughed nervously at myself. Someone's clever art project, I decided. An illusion, some high-concept piece meant to make people pause and wonder about how we interact with space or boundaries, or whatever the theme was. And yet, as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been wrong about that. The third time was different. I was restless that night, the kind of restless that makes your bed feel too small and your skin feel too tight. So I put on my coat and went out into the cold, wandering the city without a destination. It wasn't long before I found myself standing in front of the door again, as if my feet had been dragging me there the whole time. It looked the same as before, gray, unmarked, the faint etchings barely visible in the dim light. But this time, it wasn't waiting for me to notice it. It was waiting for me to act. I could feel it, humming faintly at the edges of my awareness, like a song you hear just before falling asleep. I pressed my hand to it again, and this time, I didn't pull away. The warmth spread through my palm, down my arm, and into my chest. The air around me seemed to thicken, the distant sounds of the city fading into silence. And then, before I could think better of it, I leaned forward and whispered, "What are you?" The door opened. It didn't swing inward or outward. It didn't creak on hinges or slide open like an elevator. It simply unfolded, its edges peeling away like layers of a flower, revealing a space that shouldn't have been there. I stepped through. The first thing I noticed was the smell, earthy, sweet, and faintly metallic, like rain on a garden that hadn't been touched in years. The floor beneath my feet was soft, Not wood or stone, but something that felt like moss. And the walls were alive, covered in vines that pulsed gently, like they were breathing. The light came from nowhere and everywhere at once, casting a soft golden glow over everything. In the center of the room was a table, low and round, made of something that looked like glass but shimmered like water. On it sat a single object, a small, black box. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, before I moved closer. The box was smooth, featureless, and heavier than it looked when I picked it up. It didn't have a lid or seams, no visible way to open it, but the moment I touched it, I felt something stir inside. Not physically, but deep in my mind, as though it had reached in and nudged something awake. A voice, not loud, not outside of me, but inside, small and certain, said, "Take it." I didn't ask questions. I walked back through the door with the box in my hands, and when I turned around, the door was gone. The alley was just an alley again, empty and unremarkable, and the faint warmth of the box in my hands was the only thing that told me any of it had happened. That was 3 weeks ago. The box is still with me, sitting on my nightstand, humming faintly whenever I get too close. Sometimes, I think I see shapes in the surface, reflections of things that aren't in the room. I haven't told anyone about it. I haven't tried to open it again, though I'm not sure I could if I wanted to. But the voice, the same one that told me to take it, still whispers to me sometimes. It tells me that the door isn't gone. It tells me that the box isn't finished with me yet. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I wonder if I'm finished with it. The alley was longer than it should have been. It stretched past the dim glow of the streetlights, its walls narrowing as the bricks seemed to lean closer together. Marin wasn't sure why she'd walked this way. The main street was safer, better lit, and full of people who didn't seem to notice her anyway. But the alley had called to her, not with words, but with a pull in her chest that felt like remembering something she'd never known. The first sound was faint, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. Marin stopped and turned, her breath fogging in the cold air. The alley was empty, but the tapping continued, growing louder as if the source was moving closer. She told herself to walk faster, maybe even run, but her feet stayed planted, curiosity chaining her in place. It emerged from the shadows. A man, thin as a wisp, his pale face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He carried a cane that didn't touch the ground, its tip hovering just above the cobblestones. The tapping came from that cane, though how it made the sound without contact, Marin couldn't guess. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth and warm, like an old radio host. "Lost, are you?" Marin shook her head, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I'm fine." The man tilted his head, the brim of his hat casting strange, shifting shadows over his face. Fine is a placeholder word. It fills the air when the truth is inconvenient. "Don't worry, I'm not here to pry." He tapped the cane again, the sound reverberating through the narrow alley. "But you did come this way. That means something." "I didn't mean to," Marin said, though the words felt thin in her mouth. "Oh, but you did. You always do. That's the nature of crossroads, you see." "Crossroads?" she asked, looking around. There was no intersection, no signpost, just a long, narrowing path. The man smiled, and for the first time, Marin noticed his teeth. They were wrong. Too many of them, too sharp, as though they were borrowed from something that had never been human. "A crossroads isn't a place," he said. "It's a moment, a decision. This one's yours." Marin took a step back. "I don't want anything from you." "That's what everyone says, at first. But you wouldn't have found me if you didn't. There's always something, tucked away behind the polite smiles and the tired eyes." "So, what is it? Money? Love? Time?" "Nothing," she insisted, her voice firmer now. "I'm not interested." The man leaned closer, his grin widening. "You're already interested. You just don't know what to ask for." The air grew heavier, the alley darker. The tapping of the cane turned into a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat out of sync with her own. Marin's mind raced. She didn't believe in devils or deals or magic, but something about this man was undeniable, like a story told too many times to be completely false. I don't have anything to trade, she said finally, hoping it would make him go away. His laughter was soft but sharp, a sound that seemed to scrape against her skin. Oh, my dear, everyone has something. A memory, a moment, a thread of possibility. The question is, do you value it as much as what I can give you? Marin's throat tightened. I told you, I don't want anything. He raised a hand, palm up, and the air shimmered. In it appeared a small, intricate glass orb. Inside was a flickering image, a scene from her childhood she hadn't thought of in years. Her father, long before the illness that hollowed him out, laughing as he swung her in circles. She could hear the echo of his voice, the warmth of his arms. The orb pulsed gently, a heartbeat in her palm. This is what it costs, the man said softly. A single moment, gone from your life. You'll still remember it, in pieces, like a dream. But the rest will be yours, whatever you want. Marin's hands shook as she stared at the orb. She felt the memory slipping away already, as though just holding it was enough to loosen its threads. Why me? She whispered. Why anyone? He replied, tapping his cane once more. Because you're here. Because you looked too long at the wrong shadow. Because you felt the weight of the world and thought, if only. Her chest tightened. There was something in his words that struck too close to home, something she couldn't quite deny. What if I say no? The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression that was almost pitying. You walk away, and this moment never happened. You live your life exactly as it is, knowing that it could have been different. And if I say yes? His grin returned, sharp and gleaming. Then you'll see. Marin clenched her fists, the memory pressing against her like a phantom weight. Her father's laughter, her childhood joy. It was real, tangible. But the promise of something more, something better, loomed like a storm on the horizon. She took a deep breath and threw the orb back at him. The glass shattered in midair, the pieces dissolving into smoke. The man blinked, his expression unreadable, as the shards vanished into the shadows. No, she said, her voice steady. I don't need you. For the first time, the man seemed taken aback. He tipped his hat, the shadows around him shifting like restless waves. Fair enough. But remember, crossroads don't disappear. They just move. And with a single step, he was gone, leaving Marin alone in the alley. The air lightened, the world brightening as the sound of distant traffic returned. Marin stood there for a long time, her heart still racing. When she finally turned to leave, she didn't look back. The crossroads might come again, she knew. But next time, she'd be ready. The first snowfall of the year caught me halfway through a walk I didn't even mean to take. I had just left the hardware store, a small bag of screws swinging at my side, when the first flakes began to fall. They were slow and fat, the kind of snow that seems more decorative than functional, like it's been sent by a special effects team instead of the sky. I could have headed straight home, but something about the air made me linger, pulling my scarf tighter and stuffing my free hand into my pocket. There was no destination in mind, just the quiet allure of a city muffled under the first breath of winter. I wandered into a residential neighborhood, the sidewalks cracked and uneven, the street lamps glowing faintly against the thickening gray sky. The snow picked up as I walked, clinging to my coat and collecting on the hedges lining the narrow yards. I don't know what made me stop in front of that particular house. It wasn't remarkable, a squat bungalow with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. And then I saw it. In the yard, half buried in the snow, was a yellow plastic sled. The old kind, the kind with a cracked rope handle and faded red stripes running down the sides. It leaned against a lopsided snowman that someone had half-built and then abandoned. For a moment, I just stared at it, the world narrowing to that sled, that snowman, that yard. Then, like an old photograph being developed in reverse, it hit me. I was 7 years old again, standing at the top of the biggest hill in the park behind my grandparents' house. The sled beneath me was almost identical to the one in the yard. A scuffed yellow streak of freedom, its edges nicked from countless crashes into bushes and fences. My grandpa was at the bottom of the hill, wearing his ridiculous fur hat that made him look like an Arctic explorer, his hands cupped around his mouth as he shouted encouragement. "Lean forward, but don't let go," he'd yell, as if that were all the advice a kid needed to survive a downhill sprint into chaos. The memory sharpened further. The feeling of snow crunching beneath my boots, my mittens soaked and useless after hours of dragging that sled up and down the hill. The way the cold bit at my cheeks, but never seemed to bother me as much as it does now. And the laughter. His laughter, booming and unrestrained, echoing off the icy trees like it belonged to someone twice his size. He always laughed the loudest when I crashed, especially if I ended up tumbling headfirst into a snowbank. "You're fearless," he'd say, helping me up and brushing the snow off my coat like a badge of honor. I could hear it so clearly in that moment, standing on the cracked sidewalk in front of a stranger's house. His laugh, his voice, the faint jingle of the thermos lid as he poured hot cocoa into the plastic cap for us to share. The weight of those memories hit me all at once, and I realized how long it had been since I thought about him. Not in the vague, sentimental way we remember people who are gone, but really thought about him. About his face, his voice, the exact shade of blue in his winter coat. It was like opening a drawer I hadn't touched in years, the contents spilling out in a rush of color and sound. The wind picked up, sending a flurry of snow into my face, and I snapped back to the present. The house was still there, quiet and unremarkable, but the spell hadn't entirely broken. My chest felt tight, full of something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or longing, or some combination of the two. I looked at the sled again, half buried but still sturdy, and wondered if the kids who lived here knew how lucky they were to have it. I hoped they did. I almost walked away, but something held me there for a moment longer. I glanced around, making sure no one was watching, and then I bent down, picked up a handful of snow, and packed it into a ball. It wasn't perfect, too powdery to hold its shape, but it was enough. I lobbed it gently at the snowman, watching as it landed with a soft puff against its crooked torso. And for a split second, I felt like that fearless kid again, the one who didn't care if she crashed or got snow in her boots or dropped her mittens halfway down the hill. The moment passed quickly, as these things tend to do. I brushed the snow off my gloves and headed back toward the main road, the sound of my boots crunching against the sidewalk grounding me in the here and now. But the memory lingered, warm and persistent, like a single coal glowing in the ashes of a fire. I couldn't stop thinking about him as I walked home, about how much he would have loved to see this snowfall, about the way he'd always point out the tracks left by birds or squirrels and call it nature's handwriting. It made me smile, even as the tears froze on my cheeks. When I got back to my apartment, I shook off my coat, dropped the hardware store bag on the counter, and sat down by the window with a cup of tea. The snow was still falling, soft and steady, blanketing the street in silence. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the memory one last time, imagining his laugh, his hat, the thermos of cocoa, and the sled that always seemed indestructible no matter how hard I crashed it into things. It's funny how something so ordinary, a house, a sled, a bit of snow, can hold so much of who we used to be, how it can reach across time and pull you back, even if just for a moment. Have you ever had that happen? Found yourself blindsided by something small and ordinary that opened the floodgates to a memory you didn't even know you still carried? There's a little corner store a few blocks from where I grew up, the kind of place that somehow stays in business even though it never seems to have any customers. As a kid, it always felt magical. It had this faded green awning that sagged in the middle and a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Marlene's Variety," in letters so chipped they barely held onto their shape. Marlene herself was an old woman with thick glasses and a voice like creaking floorboards. She wasn't particularly friendly, but she let us hang around as long as we didn't touch the glass jars of candy on the counter, so we made the place our unofficial headquarters every summer. When I got older, I stopped going. The magic faded, as these things always do, and Marlene's Variety became just another relic of a neighborhood I didn't think about much anymore. I moved out of my parents' place, went to college, got a job in a city I never meant to stay in, and generally made a life so distant from that little corner store that it might as well have been on another planet. But a few months ago, I ended up back in my hometown for the first time in years. My mom had some surgery, routine, but enough that she needed someone around for a bit, and so I packed a bag and came home. It was strange being back. Everything looked the same, but also not. Familiar streets felt smaller, quieter. Houses had new paint jobs, or new owners, or new additions that made them just different enough to seem foreign. On the third or fourth day, I was walking to kill time when I stumbled across Marlene's. The awning was still there, even more faded and sagging so much now that it looked like it might give up altogether. The sign was still hanging too, though it was barely readable. I didn't even realize I'd stopped walking until I found myself standing in front of the door, staring at the little bell above it, wondering if it still worked. I don't know why I went in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that strange tug of nostalgia that comes when you least expect it. The inside hadn't changed at all. Same wooden shelves that looked like they might collapse under the weight of all the junk stacked on them. Same jars of candy on the counter. Same faint smell of dust and something that might have been vanilla if you squinted hard enough. But Marlene wasn't there. Instead, a younger guy, maybe in his 30s, sat behind the counter, reading a paperback with the cover half torn off. "Hi," I said awkwardly, unsure if he'd even noticed me come in. He looked up, startled, like he hadn't had a customer in days. "Hey," he said, closing the book and sitting up a little straighter. "Let me know if you need anything." I nodded, pretending to browse while I tried to piece together what had happened. Had Marlene retired? Moved away? Died? It felt weird to ask, so I didn't. I just wandered the aisles, my fingers brushing over items that had probably been on the shelves for decades. Old tins of cookies with faded labels, decks of playing cards in flimsy cardboard boxes, jars of pickles that looked suspiciously untrustworthy. Then I saw it. A metal rack near the back of the store, one of those rotating ones meant for postcards or greeting cards. But instead of cards, it was filled with small, battered notebooks. They weren't for sale. At least, there were no price tags on them. They looked homemade, with rough covers made of cardboard or scraps of fabric, and pages that were unevenly cut, sticking out at odd angles. Some had words scrawled on the front in messy handwriting. Others were blank. "Are these?" I started, pointing to the rack. The guy behind the counter glanced up. "Oh, those? Yeah, they've been here forever. Marlene started it years ago, before I took over. People just leave things in them." "Leave things?" I asked, stepping closer. "Yeah, like notes, drawings, poems, whatever. It's kind of like a community diary, I guess. I thought about getting rid of them when I took over, but people still add to them every now and then, so I figured why not keep it going." I pulled one of the notebooks off the rack. The cover was made from what looked like an old cereal box, and the first page had a single line written in blue ink. "This is my favorite hiding spot." I flipped through and found a mess of other entries. Someone had drawn a picture of a cat wearing sunglasses. Another page had a list of song lyrics, none of them finished. Someone else had written, "I come here when I feel invisible." The next notebook was no less chaotic. A grocery list with only 3 items: milk, bread, courage. A half-legible letter addressed to no one in particular. "I miss the way things used to be. I hope you're happy now. I hope you found it." One page just had the word "run" scrawled across it in giant, shaky letters. And then I found it. A page near the back of a notebook with a green fabric cover. Written in the unmistakable, looping handwriting of a 12-year-old was a note signed with my own name. "If you're reading this, it means you're still here. I hope you remember how to be brave." I froze, the notebook suddenly heavy in my hands. I had no memory of writing it, but I knew it was mine. The handwriting was unmistakable, as was the melodramatic tone that only a preteen could achieve. I flipped the page, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the next page was blank. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those words. Long enough for the guy at the counter to clear his throat awkwardly. "Find something interesting?" he asked. I slid the notebook back onto the rack and nodded. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't elaborate. I left without buying anything, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. About the person I'd been when I wrote it, and why I'd left it there, as if I'd known I'd need to see it again someday. I walked the long way home, my mind racing with fragments of memories I hadn't touched in years. It's funny, isn't it? How you can leave pieces of yourself in the strangest places, and how, years later, they find their way back to you, as if to remind you of something you didn't even know you'd forgotten. I once spent an entire afternoon being followed by a goat. This wasn't on a farm or in some charming European countryside. It was in the middle of a small suburban park, and it was the most absurd 3 hours of my life. To this day, I can't decide if it was some cosmic prank or if the goat had just chosen me as its unlikely new best friend. It began on a Saturday, one of those rare days where I had no plans and decided to take a long walk to clear my head. The park was quiet, dotted with joggers and a few kids tossing a frisbee. I just settled onto a bench with a coffee when I heard the sound of hooves behind me, a soft clomp clomp clomp. I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone was walking a particularly heavy-footed dog. When I turned around, I was face to face with a goat. It wasn't a large goat, but it had the unmistakable look of an animal that was up to something. Its fur was a mottled gray and white. Its eyes were those weird horizontal rectangles that made it seem both curious and mildly judgmental, and its little beard wobbled as it tilted its head at me. I stared at it. It stared back. I said, as if goats respond to words. It bleated once, loud and confident, and then did the unthinkable. It jumped onto the bench next to me, like we were two old friends meeting for coffee. Okay, no, I muttered, standing up and stepping away, but the goat hopped off the bench and followed me, its little hooves tapping against the path. I looked around, hoping anyone, would explain why a goat was casually roaming the park, but no one seemed to notice. The joggers jogged, the frisbee kids cheered, and I was left with a goat shadowing me like we were in some low-budget animal buddy movie. Shoo, I said, waving my arms. The goat just blinked, unimpressed. I decided to ignore it and keep walking, thinking it would lose interest. Spoiler, it didn't. For the next hour, no matter where I went, past the pond, through the picnic area, even into the public restroom, don't ask, the goat stayed within a few feet of me. It didn't try to bite me or anything. It just hung out, like this was perfectly normal. At one point, I tried calling animal control, but the woman on the phone sounded suspiciously like she didn't believe me. A goat, she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Yes, a goat, I replied, glancing down at my new companion, who was now chewing on a stray wrapper it had found on the ground. Is it aggressive? No, I said. It's just really persistent. She told me they'd send someone to check it out, but by then, I wasn't even sure what I'd say when they arrived. Hello, yes, this is the goat. It won't leave me alone. Arrest it? Somewhere along the way, I gave up trying to shake it off. We ended up sitting together on a grassy hill, the goat munching lazily on a patch of dandelions while I scrolled through my phone. I even Googled, why would a goat follow someone? But the results were less than helpful. Something about herd behavior? Maybe it thought I was its leader now? I didn't ask for this responsibility, but the goat clearly had other plans. Eventually, an older man with a thick mustache came trudging up the hill, carrying a length of rope. There you are, he called out, his voice heavy with relief. The goat perked up, its ears twitching, but it didn't move. The man stopped in front of me, wiping sweat from his brow. Been looking for this little rascal all morning. Escaped from the petting zoo down the road. A petting zoo? I repeated, trying not to laugh. Of course, because why wouldn't there be a rogue petting zoo goat in the middle of my perfectly normal suburban park? Yeah, he said, looping the rope around the goat's neck. This one's a troublemaker, always finding a way out. The goat bleated indignantly, as if to protest this characterization. I watched as the man led it away, its hooves clacking rhythmically against the pavement. Just before they disappeared over the hill, the goat turned its head and gave me one last look, like it was trying to tell me something. I never figured out what that goat wanted or why it picked me that day, but for some reason, the whole experience stuck with me. Maybe it was because it felt like such a random, bizarre moment in a life otherwise filled with schedules and routines. Or maybe it was just the absurdity of it all. A reminder that not everything has to make sense to be meaningful. Since then, I found myself thinking about that goat more often than I'd like to admit. It's become this weird little symbol for me, a reminder to roll with the unexpected and find humor in the chaos. And sometimes, When I'm having a particularly strange or frustrating day, I catch myself muttering, "What would the goat do?" So here's my question. What's the most random, out-of-nowhere thing that's ever happened to you? The kind of moment that felt so absurd you couldn't help but laugh, or maybe even learn something from it. The ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound in the room. It stood in the corner like a sentinel, its pendulum swinging with unyielding precision. Lena sat in the armchair opposite her grandmother, who was meticulously untangling a skein of red yarn. The silence between them wasn't strained but layered, like the quiet between old friends. Lena's eyes drifted to the fireplace. Above the mantel was a painting she had always hated as a child. It depicted a dark forest with a single narrow path snaking through it. Her grandmother once told her the painting was a door. Back then, Lena had believed her. Now, at 32, she simply found it unnerving. "Still can't take your eyes off it, can you?" her grandmother asked without looking up. Her voice was calm, almost playful. "It's creepy," Lena admitted. "I don't know why you keep it." Her grandmother smiled faintly. "Because it's mine, and because it's useful." "Useful?" Lena repeated, furrowing her brow. Her grandmother set down the yarn and leaned back in her chair, her weathered hands resting on her lap. "Every family has secrets, my dear. Ours just happens to be in plain sight." Lena laughed, though it came out uneven. "You always loved your riddles." Her grandmother didn't reply. Instead, she nodded toward the painting. "Go ahead. Touch it. Touch it. Yes, unless you're scared." The challenge in her grandmother's tone sparked something stubborn in Lena. Rising from her chair, she crossed the room and stood before the painting. Up close, the brushstrokes were more chaotic than she remembered, the forest almost writhing under her gaze. She reached out, expecting to feel the cool surface of the canvas. Instead, her fingers met something warmer, softer, like the surface of a pond. The painting rippled beneath her touch. Startled, she pulled her hand back. "What the?" "Push through," her grandmother said, her voice still calm. Lena turned, half expecting her grandmother to burst out laughing. But her expression was serene, expectant. Against her better judgment, Lena pressed her hand forward again. This time, the resistance gave way, and her arm vanished into the painting. The sensation was indescribable, like wading through a current of liquid light. Before she could pull back, the floor beneath her seemed to dissolve. Gravity flipped, twisted, and Lena fell, not down, but sideways. The air rushed past her ears, and the world turned dark. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the forest from the painting. The trees were impossibly tall, their canopies forming a lattice that barely allowed sunlight to filter through. The air smelled of moss and something faintly metallic. The path stretched before her, just as it had in the painting. "Okay," she muttered, brushing dirt off her jeans. "This is new." She turned to look behind her but found nothing but more trees. The painting, her grandmother, the armchair, gone. Swallowing her unease, she stepped onto the path. As she walked, the forest seemed to shift subtly, branches arching and twisting as though alive. The path began to narrow, and the silence deepened, so complete it pressed against her eardrums. Then came the whispering. At first, Lena thought it was the wind, but the sounds formed words, fragmented and overlapping, like a dozen voices speaking at once. "Turn back. Too late now. You asked for this." "Who's there?" Lena called, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound firm. The whispers stopped. In their place came a single voice, clear and resonant. "You shouldn't have come alone." Lena spun around, but the forest was empty. Her breath quickened as the path began to shift underfoot, the ground rippling like a snake's scales. She broke into a run, her pulse pounding in her ears. The path abruptly ended at a clearing, and at its center stood a house. It was a smaller, warped version of her grandmother's home, its shingles missing and windows opaque. Something about it felt alive, as if it were watching her. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, she stepped closer. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was heavy, almost viscous, and each step felt like wading through molasses. Lena, the voice said again, but now it came from everywhere. Who are you? She demanded, her fists clenched. You know me, it replied. I've always been with you. The hallway ended in a room that mirrored her grandmother's sitting room, except the walls were lined with mirrors. Each reflection of Lena was subtly different. In one, she wore her hair long, as she had in college. In another, she held a child's hand, though she had no children. One reflection stared at her with eyes that weren't hers, cold and calculating. This is your inheritance, the voice said. Your family's gift and burden. You carry every version of yourself, even the ones you wish you didn't. The mirrors began to ripple, and the reflections stepped forward, merging into a single figure. It was her, but not her. A Lena who stood taller, her eyes burning with an intensity that pinned her in place. What do you want from me? Lena whispered. The other Lena smiled faintly. To remember, and to choose. Before she could ask what that meant, the floor beneath her gave way again. The rush of air returned, and she tumbled backward, landing with a jolt in her grandmother's sitting room. The clock still ticked, and her grandmother still sat with the red yarn. You're back, her grandmother said, without looking up. What was that? Lena demanded, her voice shaky. Your inheritance, her grandmother replied simply. Now, what will you do with it? The painting on the wall was still, but Lena could feel the forest within it watching, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be in the pharmacy that day. I had no prescriptions to pick up, no urgent need for cough drops or toothpaste. But my neighbor's dog, a grumpy old mutt who I occasionally dog-sit, had decided to eat half of a chocolate bar he'd stolen off the counter. Panicked, my neighbor had texted me in all caps asking if I could grab some hydrogen peroxide to make the dog throw up, which, as I later learned, is both a semi-valid emergency tactic and a deeply unpleasant experience for everyone involved. Anyway, that's how I found myself in aisle 7, squinting at a shelf of first aid products, wondering why there were 20 different kinds of hydrogen peroxide. I finally grabbed the cheapest bottle and headed to the counter. The place was mostly empty except for the cashier, a bored-looking teenager with a name tag that said Jeremy, and an older man in a long coat, hunched over one of those blood pressure machines in the corner. You know, the ones, dusty, relics of a time when public health gadgets were exciting. He was sitting very still, his arm in the cuff, staring at the little digital screen as it beeped and flashed. Something about him made me pause. He wasn't just still. He was too still. I told myself to mind my own business. I paid for the peroxide, stuffed the bottle in my bag, and headed for the exit. But as I passed the man, I noticed the screen on the blood pressure machine wasn't lit up. It was off, unplugged, in fact, the cord dangling uselessly behind the chair. Are you okay? I heard myself ask, before I could think better of it. The man didn't respond. For a moment, I wondered if he'd even heard me. Then, very slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. His face was pale, the kind of pale that makes you think of hospital sheets or snow under fluorescent lights. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp, like they'd been honed into points. The numbers aren't adding up, he said. His voice was low and scratchy, as if he hadn't spoken in years. I glanced back at the machine, still dark and lifeless. It's, not plugged in. I know, he said, almost irritated. That's the problem. I should have walked away. I should have smiled politely, mumbled something about being late, and left him to his unplugged existential crisis. But something about the way he said it, the calm certainty, like he wasn't confused at all, made me stay. What numbers? I asked before I could stop myself. He leaned back in the chair, his arm still stuck in the dead cuff. They keep changing. Every time I sit here, they're different. Too high, too low, then nothing at all. But none of it makes sense. They're just numbers. Just numbers. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. If it's not plugged in, it's not going to give you any numbers, I said carefully, as though I were explaining it to a child. He nodded, like he agreed with me completely. That's what I thought, at first. But then I realized, it doesn't need to be plugged in. It's not measuring me. Okay, I said, because that felt like a safe word. It's measuring everything else, he continued. his voice dropping even lower. The air, the room, you, me, time. It's all numbers. It's all patterns. But the patterns aren't right. Something's off. They don't add up anymore. I didn't know what to say to that. I glanced over my shoulder at Jeremy, who was scrolling on his phone and clearly oblivious to the weirdness unfolding in the corner. I could just leave, I thought. I could walk out the door and let this man spiral into whatever numbers-based breakdown he was having. But I didn't. Instead, I did something that, in retrospect, feels like a mistake. I asked him, "What happens if the numbers don't add up?" For the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile you see in your peripheral vision and hope you imagined. "Everything stops," he said. My mouth went dry. Everything? Everything. The cuff around his arm beeped. Just once. A sharp, electronic chirp, like the sound a smoke detector makes when it's running out of batteries. I jumped. He didn't. He just sat there, still as ever, watching me with those knife-sharp eyes. I took a step back, my pulse racing in a way that felt ironic given the context. I should go, I stammered, clutching the bag with the peroxide like it was a shield. "You can't fix it," he said, his tone almost gentle now. "No one can. But you'll notice it soon enough. You'll see the patterns. And when you do, well..." He didn't finish the sentence. He just slipped his arm out of the cuff, stood up, and walked out of the store without another word. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the unplugged machine, half expecting it to spring to life and start spitting out random numbers. It didn't, of course. It just sat there, quiet and useless, like a prop in a play no one was watching. Eventually, I left. I went home, helped my neighbor with her dog, who was fine, by the way, in case you were worried, and tried to forget about the man and his nonsense about numbers. But I couldn't. For weeks, I kept thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, the eerie calm in his voice. And then, little things started to catch my attention. Digital clocks that blinked the wrong time for just a second before correcting themselves, patterns in phone numbers that felt too deliberate, a radio station that played the same song twice in a row. It's probably nothing, just my brain playing tricks on me. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what if the numbers really don't add up? And if they don't, what happens next? You ever feel like there's something out there? Something small, something invisible, that's just a little bit off, like the universe missed a step somewhere? Or is it just me? There's a bookstore I sometimes wander into on my way home from work, not because I'm looking for anything in particular, but because it's one of those places that feels like a time capsule of someone's imagination. The shelves are crammed with books that don't make sense together. Rare first editions sandwiched next to glossy coffee table books about architecture, dog-eared fantasy novels sharing space with yellowed encyclopedias. The owner, a tall man with wiry glasses and a tendency to hum quietly to himself, has an inexplicable system of organization that he refuses to explain. I once asked if the books were sorted by genre, and he just smiled and said, "Oh, no, that'd be boring." The air in there always smells faintly of old paper and oranges, though I've never seen anyone eating one. Sometimes there's music playing, scratchy jazz records, or instrumental covers of songs you wouldn't expect, like an accordion version of Nirvana's Come As You Are. I like to pretend the shop is alive, rearranging itself when no one's looking, and the thought makes me want to explore it even more. It was on one of these aimless visits that I found the notebook. I'd been half-heartedly flipping through a stack of poetry anthologies when my hand bumped into a thin, unmarked spiral-bound journal tucked between two hardcover collections. It was the kind of notebook you could buy at a dollar store, plain and nondescript, with a flimsy cardboard cover and a spiral that was slightly bent at the edges. It didn't belong on the shelf. I assumed someone had left it there by mistake, maybe a customer or one of the shop's regulars. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the notebook, the first page was blank, but the second was filled with handwriting, scrawled in uneven loops and jagged lines that climbed and dipped like a seismograph. It didn't start with "Dear Diary" or any kind of introduction. It just dove straight in mid-thought. "I think the pigeons know. They've been watching me for weeks now, the same group, always at the same time. I don't think they're normal pigeons." I blinked, then read the line again, trying to decide if it was a joke or part of some elaborate story. The writing wasn't neat. Some words were smudged, others crammed into the corners of the page, like the writer had run out of space and refused to start over. There were arrows and underlines and random doodles in the margins, little spirals and stars that made the whole thing feel more like a map of someone's thoughts than a coherent entry. I flipped to the next page. I saw one today with a scar across its wing. I think it's the leader. Every time I look at it, it tilts its head like it's mocking me, or maybe warning me. I threw a piece of bread, and it just stared at me. What kind of pigeon doesn't eat bread? The rest of the page was filled with sketches of pigeons, rough, hurried drawings with exaggerated eyes and markings. Some of them looked almost cartoonish, while others were detailed enough that I could see the faint texture of feathers in the pencil strokes. I should have put the notebook back. I knew that. It felt like eavesdropping on someone's private world, and yet I couldn't stop turning the pages. The next entry was even stranger. They're following me now, not just in the park, on the train, at the grocery store, even at work. I saw one perched outside the window of the break room today. It was the scarred one again. I told Jake, but he just laughed and said, "You need to get more sleep." He doesn't understand. None of them do. The more I read, the less it felt like fiction. There was a desperation in the writing, a kind of frantic urgency that made it hard to look away. The pigeons weren't just pigeons to this person. They were symbols, messengers, maybe even spies. The entries began to spiral further into paranoia, with the writer describing how they'd started changing their routes home, wearing hats to disguise themselves, and even keeping a journal of pigeon sightings, a list that was detailed in the notebook, complete with dates, times, and descriptions like gray with white speckles, stared at me for 12 seconds. I glanced around the bookstore, half expecting someone to come rushing over and snatch the notebook from my hands. But no one seemed to notice me. The owner was humming to himself behind the counter, stacking a precarious tower of books that looked like it might collapse at any moment. I turned to the last entry. They're not pigeons. I know that now. I saw one shed a feather, and it wasn't a feather at all. It was metal. I don't think they're birds. I don't even think they're alive in the way we understand it. I tried to tell Jake again, but he just rolled his eyes and said, "You've been watching too many movies. I'm not sure what to do anymore. If you're reading this, whoever you are, watch the pigeons. They're everywhere." That was it. No explanation, no signature, no satisfying conclusion. Just a blank page staring up at me like the notebook itself was daring me to believe it. I closed the notebook and stared at it for a long time, debating whether to tell the shop owner. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought that whoever had written it might come back looking for it. Or maybe it was the absurd but strangely compelling notion that the writer was right, that the pigeons were more than they seemed, and by taking the notebook, I'd somehow get involved in whatever strange story they'd stumbled into. In the end, I left the notebook where I found it, tucked between the poetry anthologies, as if it had always been there. As I walked home, I couldn't help but glance at every pigeon I passed, their beady eyes suddenly seeming a little too focused, their movements a little too calculated. I haven't been back to the bookstore since, but I can't stop thinking about that notebook, about the writer and their pigeons, about how truth and imagination blur in ways we'll never fully understand. And sometimes, when I see a pigeon perched on a streetlight or bobbing its head near a park bench, I wonder if it's watching me, too. There was this laundromat near my old apartment, the kind of place you'd never notice unless you needed it, tucked between a boarded-up florist and a diner that hadn't updated its menu since the 80s. It was small and quiet, with cracked linoleum floors and a vending machine that always stole your quarters. Most people hated going there, but I didn't mind. It was comforting in a way. The hum of the machines, the faint smell of detergent in the air, the rhythmic clink of zippers and buttons tumbling in the dryers. It all felt like background noise to life, like a heartbeat you didn't have to think about. That night, though, was different. I didn't plan to be there. I'd gone home after work to find that my upstairs neighbor had let her sink overflow again, and the water had leaked into my apartment, drenching everything in its path, including the basket of clean laundry I'd left by the door. The laundromat was my only option, even though it was already close to midnight, and I was running on fumes. I threw on a hoodie, stuffed my soggy clothes into a garbage bag, and walked the 2 blocks there. hoping to get in and out as quickly as possible. When I arrived, the place was completely empty, except for an older man sitting in the corner by the dryers. He was slouched in one of those hard plastic chairs, flipping through an ancient magazine, the kind with yellowed pages and advertisements for things that didn't exist anymore. He glanced up when I walked in, gave me a quick nod, and went back to his magazine. I barely noticed him after that. I was too busy wrestling with the washing machine, trying to coax it into taking my crumpled dollar bills. Once I got the cycle started, I sat down on the opposite side of the room and stared at my phone, scrolling aimlessly. The minutes dragged. I could hear the faint squeak of the man's chair every time he shifted, the crinkling of the magazine pages as he turned them. At some point, though, I realized the noise had stopped. When I glanced up, he was no longer in the chair. Instead, he was standing by one of the dryers, staring at something he'd just pulled out. His face was unreadable, like he was somewhere far away in his own mind. He held it up, and I saw it was a jacket. A kid's jacket, bright red, the kind with a zipper that never quite works the way it's supposed to. It looked old, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, but it was clean, almost like it didn't belong in this world of rumpled clothes and detergent stains. He turned it over in his hands, slowly, like he was afraid it might crumble if he wasn't careful. For a moment, I thought he might put it on, but instead, he just stood there, holding it, not moving. It felt wrong to keep watching him, but I couldn't help it. There was something in the way he looked at that jacket that made the whole room feel heavy, like we were sitting inside someone else's memory. He didn't say anything. He didn't even notice I was there. But something about his silence was so loud it made my chest ache. When he finally sat back down, the jacket folded carefully in his lap, I couldn't take it anymore. I'm not usually the kind of person to talk to strangers, especially not at midnight in a laundromat. But the words came out before I could stop them. "It's a nice jacket," I said, my voice too loud in the stillness. He looked up, startled, like he'd forgotten anyone else was there. For a second, I thought he might ignore me, but then he nodded slowly. "It was my son's," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel, but soft at the edges. "I found it in the back of a closet last week. Thought it was long gone." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, hoping he wouldn't think I was prying. But he kept talking, like he needed to say it out loud to make it real. "He used to wear it everywhere," he said, "even in the summer. Said it made him look like a superhero." He laughed a little, but it was the kind of laugh that feels more like a sigh. I told him he'd outgrow it by fall, but he didn't care. And when he finally did, well, I guess we just stuffed it in a box and forgot about it. I wanted to ask where his son was now, but I didn't. I didn't have to. The weight in his voice said everything. Instead, I said, "It's funny, isn't it? The things that stick around. Stuff you don't even know you've kept, and then one day it shows up again." He nodded, his fingers tracing the seams of the jacket like he was memorizing them. "Yeah," he said quietly, "like it was waiting for you." Neither of us said anything after that. He folded the jacket carefully, almost ceremoniously, and tucked it into his laundry basket. Then he stood up, nodded at me again, and walked out into the night, leaving behind the faint smell of detergent and something else I couldn't quite place. Something older. Something that felt like the echo of a memory I didn't even know I had. When my load finished, I pulled my clothes out of the washer, but I couldn't bring myself to start the dryer right away. Instead, I sat there for a while, staring at the machine as it cooled down, thinking about all the little things we leave behind without realizing it. The jacket stuffed in closets. The birthday cards at the bottom of a drawer. The way a laundromat can suddenly feel like a museum of someone else's life. I never saw that man again, but sometimes, when I walk past that laundromat, I think about him, about the jacket, about the way he held it like it was a piece of time he'd managed to steal back, even if only for a moment. And I wonder how many of us are carrying something like that. A thing we've kept without knowing why, waiting quietly for the right time to remind us of everything we thought we'd forgotten. The town square was empty when Paul found the box. It sat in the shadow of the old clock tower, an unassuming cube of polished wood, gleaming faintly in the pale afternoon light. He glanced around, but there was no one, just the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of cars from the highway. Something about the box made him pause. It wasn't just the craftsmanship, it was the feeling that it had been waiting. The lid opened with a soft click when he lifted it. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. The card was ordinary enough, except for the faint shimmer of its edges, as though it had been dipped in starlight. He flipped it over, expecting a message or a name, but the back was blank. Paul felt a pang of disappointment, but slipped the card into his pocket anyway. He didn't know why. By the time he got home, he'd forgotten about it. Dinner was the usual blur of small talk and the rhythmic clink of cutlery, his wife's voice blending into the background as he nodded at the right moments. Afterward, he sat on the couch, scrolling through channels without really watching, his thoughts drifting. It wasn't until he went to change for bed that he remembered the card. It was sitting on his nightstand. Paul frowned. He was sure he'd left it in his coat pocket. Yet there it was, the Queen of Spades staring up at him. He picked it up, the faint shimmer catching the light, and for a moment, the room seemed darker, the shadows deeper. He shook his head and set the card down, chalking it up to a long day. But when he woke, the card was under his pillow. It didn't make sense. He hadn't touched it after putting it on the nightstand. His wife, still asleep beside him, couldn't have moved it. She didn't even know about it. He sat up, holding the card, and for the first time, he noticed something new. The Queen's expression had changed. Where before she had worn the faintest hint of a smile, her lips were now slightly parted, her eyes wider. Watching, Paul shoved the card into his bedside drawer and didn't think about it again until later that afternoon. He was walking back from the grocery store when he spotted something odd. The Queen of Spades painted on the wall of a building he'd passed countless times. The paint was fresh, glistening in the sunlight. And just like the card, the Queen's expression was watching him. He hurried home, the bags digging into his fingers, his pulse quickening. When he reached the kitchen, he dropped everything and opened the drawer. The card was gone. By nightfall, it had escalated. Every reflective surface seemed to show her face, faint and fleeting, like a trick of the light. The bathroom mirror, the television screen, even the surface of his coffee. It was all her, smiling, waiting. Paul stopped sleeping. On the fourth day, the world outside began to shift. The streets were quieter than usual, the people fewer. The birds, once a constant backdrop, had fallen silent. And everywhere he went, the Queen was there. In graffiti, in the cracks of the pavement, in the newspapers folded neatly on benches. By the fifth day, the whispers began. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing past his ear. But they grew louder, more distinct, until they formed words, "Draw again." Paul tried to ignore it. He shut himself in the house, drawing the curtains and turning on every light. But the whispers seeped through, a constant hum that burrowed into his mind. By the sixth day, he was desperate. The box reappeared on the kitchen table that morning, as though it had always been there. Paul stared at it, his hands trembling. "Draw again," the whispers urged. He didn't want to, but his hands moved anyway, lifting the lid. Inside was another card, its edges gleaming like the first, the Ace of Hearts. The moment he touched it, the whispers stopped. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. That night, the dreams began. He was in a vast, empty room, the walls lined with mirrors. In every reflection, the Queen and the Ace stared back at him, their faces alive, their mouths moving soundlessly. When he woke, he could still feel their eyes on him. The cards multiplied. Each day, the box returned with a new one, a jack, a 10, a king, until he had almost a full deck. With every card, the world grew stranger. The streets twisted, leading him to places he didn't recognize. The few people he encountered spoke in fragments, their eyes dull and glassy. On the final day, the deck was complete. Paul held the last card, a joker, in his shaking hands. The whispers had returned, louder and more frantic than ever, urging him toward the old clock tower where he'd first found the box. He climbed the stairs, the cards clutched to his chest, the air growing colder with every step. At the top, the clock's massive face loomed above him, the gears clicking in a rhythm that felt alive. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, another box. This one was larger, made of dark metal etched with intricate symbols. As Paul approached, the cards in his hands began to glow. He didn't need the whispers to tell him what to do. He placed the deck inside the box and stepped back. The room shuddered. The clock stopped, and the queen appeared, stepping out of the shadows, her dress flowing like liquid ink. She smiled, her expression no longer watching but approving. "You've completed the game," she said, her voice rich and resonant. "And now it begins." The box snapped shut, the sound echoing through the chamber. When Paul turned to look at the clock face, it was no longer showing the time. Instead, it displayed a single card, the Queen of Spades. The last thing Paul heard was her laughter. "When I was 15, my dad bought a boat. Not a sleek speedboat or a classic sailboat or even one of those sturdy fishing vessels you see in the movies, but a creaky, second-hand rowboat with peeling green paint and oars that looked like they were on the verge of splintering. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see tied up on the edge of a swamp, not sitting on a trailer in our driveway in suburban Ohio. He called it the Lucky Duck, though the only luck involved seemed to be that it hadn't sunk on the way home. My mom rolled her eyes when she saw it, muttering something about another one of his projects, but I thought it was kind of cool in a strange way. My dad, ever the optimist, said it was going to bring the family together. He gave my mom a look that said she'd better not argue and announced that we'd be taking it out that weekend. The thing is, none of us had any real experience with boats. My dad grew up in Kansas, as landlocked as it gets, and his love for the water came entirely from watching old adventure movies. My mom once got seasick on a ferry ride to Mackinac Island. And me? Well, I was 15 and mostly preoccupied with trying to convince my parents to let me dye my hair blue. So, naturally, we decided to take the Lucky Duck out on a lake we'd never been to, with no real plan and only a vague sense of what we were doing. That Saturday, we loaded the boat onto the roof of the minivan. Yes, the roof, because my dad hadn't gotten around to buying the proper trailer hitch yet, and drove an hour to some lake he'd found on Google Maps. The whole way there, I alternated between staring out the window and listening to my dad explain the art of rowing, like he was some kind of nautical philosopher. My mom, clearly skeptical but trying to be supportive, kept making these small, non-committal noises in response. When we got to the lake, it was bigger than I'd expected, with dark green water that shimmered under the afternoon sun. We carried the boat to the shore, which was harder than it looked because one of the oars kept slipping out of my dad's grip and whacking me in the shin. By the time we got it into the water, I was already regretting everything. My dad climbed in first, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. My mom followed, wobbling as she tried to find her balance, and then it was my turn. I stepped into the boat, and before I even had a chance to sit down, the whole thing tipped sharply to the left. My mom shrieked, grabbing onto my dad's arm, and I flailed like a cartoon character trying to keep my footing. Somehow, miraculously, none of us fell in. Once we were all settled, my dad started rowing. Or at least, he tried to. The oars kept getting stuck in the water, and every time he pulled, the boat veered sharply to one side. "It's harder than it looks," he said, which was quickly becoming his catchphrase of the day. After about 15 minutes of zigzagging across the lake, we finally found a rhythm. The boat moved smoothly through the water, and for a brief moment, it actually felt peaceful. My dad even started whistling some old sea shanty he'd probably learned from a movie. And then, out of nowhere, the left oar snapped in half. There was a loud crack, followed by a splash as the broken piece disappeared into the water. My dad stared at the stub of the oar in his hands, completely speechless. My mom groaned. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. "What are we supposed to do now?" my mom asked, crossing her arms. My dad, ever the optimist, said, "We'll improvise." He tried to use the broken oar to paddle, but it was completely useless. The boat just spun in circles like some kind of drunk carnival ride. My mom was not amused. By this point, the shore was a good distance away, and the sun was starting to set. The lake was empty except for us. No other boats, no swimmers, just the sound of water lapping against the sides of the Lucky Duck. It was beautiful in a way, though I wasn't exactly in the mood to appreciate it. "We're going to have to swim back," my mom said, glaring at my dad like this was somehow his fault. But my dad wasn't ready to give up. He stood up in the boat, very dramatically, I might add, and declared, "We'll use our hands." "Are you serious?" my mom asked, but he was already leaning over the side, paddling with both hands like he was auditioning for a slapstick comedy. It actually worked. Sort of. We started inching toward the shore, though at this rate, it was going to take hours. I sighed, rolled up my sleeves, and joined in. My mom reluctantly did the same, muttering under her breath the entire time. We must have been quite the sight. 3 people in a rickety rowboat, splashing and flailing like we were trying to put out a fire. By the time we reached the shore, we were soaked, exhausted, and laughing so hard we could barely stand. My mom gave my dad a look that said, "Never again," but even she was smiling. The boat sat in our garage for years after that, gathering dust. My dad kept saying he'd fix it, but he never did. Every once in a while, I'd catch him looking at it like it was some kind of unfinished symphony. The funny thing is, I don't remember much else about that summer. I couldn't tell you what movies I saw or what songs were on the radio. But I remember that day on the lake. How ridiculous it was, how frustrating, and how, in the end, it actually did bring us together, just like my dad said it would. Sometimes I wonder if he knew all along it was going to turn out like that. If maybe the boat wasn't the point at all. So, here's a question. Have you ever gone into something thinking it would be one thing, only to have it turn into something completely different? And was it better, or worse, than you expected? The silence in the library had weight, a density that pressed against the air, turning the faint rustle of pages into something profound. Emily sat in the corner, where the light was dimmest, surrounded by books older than her grandparents. She had been coming here every Thursday for months, though no one had noticed. That was the thing about Emily. She moved through the world like a ghost even while alive. Today, though, was different. On the table before her lay a book bound in dark green leather, its edges worn but well kept, as if it had been waiting for hands like hers. The title was embossed in a language she couldn't identify, the letters curling and twisting in alien shapes. She hadn't chosen the book. It had been on the table when she arrived, unassuming but oddly magnetic. When she opened it, the first page was blank. So was the second, and the third. By the 10th blank page, Emily was certain it was a mistake, an empty book tucked into the wrong section. Yet, as she reached to close it, words appeared on the next page. Not ink, but shadows forming letters as though light itself had been pulled into the paper. "Emily, tell me a secret." Her breath caught. The room around her felt suddenly colder. She looked around, half expecting someone to emerge from behind the shelves, but the library remained still. She stared at the words, their shapes rippling faintly as if alive. Against her better judgment, she whispered, "I don't have any." The shadows rearranged themselves on the page. "Everyone has secrets, even you. Share one, and I will share mine." She hesitated. It was ridiculous to feel as though she were speaking to someone, or something real. But the words tugged at her in a way that bypassed logic, reaching into some raw, unguarded place in her chest. Finally, she whispered, "I hate the sound of my own voice. I've avoided speaking in crowds my entire life because I'm convinced it makes people uncomfortable." The words vanished. A moment later, new ones appeared. "Thank you. Here is mine. I was written by hands that no longer exist." A chill ran through her. She flipped the page, but it was blank again. Emily frowned, closing the book and pushing it away. The moment she did, the lights above her flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. That night, she dreamed of the book. It appeared on her bedside table, its green leather gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She reached for it in the dream, her fingers brushing the cover. The voice from the page was in her head now, low and murmuring, "Ask, and I will answer." When she woke, the book was gone. Her chest felt heavy, as though the dream had been more than imagination. She tried to shake it off, but the memory clung to her like damp clothes. By the time the next Thursday arrived, she had convinced herself not to return to the library. She went anyway. The book was waiting for her. This time, she didn't touch it immediately. She circled the table like a wary animal, half expecting it to move on its own. Finally, she sat down and opened it. The first page was blank. Then the words emerged, smooth and familiar. "You came back. Why?" Emily hesitated, unsure how to answer. The words shifted again, impatient. "What would you like to know?" She leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Where do you come from?" The response came quickly this time. "I am a collection of truths no one wanted to hear. I was bound in leather to keep the words contained, but they never truly stay." Emily's hands trembled as she traced the edges of the book. "And the people who wrote you? What happened to them?" The text paused, as though considering her question. Some grew afraid of what they learned. Others became consumed by it. None remained unchanged. She closed the book and left it behind. But it didn't leave her. The following days, she found herself murmuring questions to the silence of her room, imagining how the book might respond. She dreamt of the words more vividly each night, waking with sentences she didn't understand echoing in her mind. Her appetite waned, her focus fractured. Friends who rarely noticed her began asking if she was okay, which only deepened her unease. The next Thursday, she returned again. The book was there. This time, she didn't hesitate. "What do you want from me?" she asked aloud. The shadows on the page shifted more slowly now, deliberate. "To be read, to be known, to become part of you, as you will become part of me." The words unsettled her, but she couldn't tear herself away. The questions poured out of her like water from a broken dam. She asked about the past, the future, the universe. Each time, the book answered, not with clarity, but with threads of truths woven into riddles. She should have been frustrated, but instead, she felt exhilarated. It was as though the book understood her in a way no one else ever had. Weeks turned into months. Emily's world narrowed to the library and the book. She stopped dreaming entirely. Her nights became black, her days consumed by the shadows on those ancient pages. She began to notice changes in herself, small at first. Her reflection grew less distinct, her outline blurred as though viewed through frosted glass. Her voice softened to a whisper no one seemed to hear anymore. Even her thoughts felt less like her own. One day, as she turned the final page, she found no words waiting for her. Just a blank expanse. She whispered, "What now?" The shadows rose from the page, coiling like smoke. For the first time, the voice wasn't on the paper. It was inside her. "Now, you write." And so she did.